Nitocris of Egypt. She may be the oldest queen on this list and the most disputed, which somehow makes her more terrifying, not less. Nitocris ruled at the very end of Egypt's Old Kingdom around 2184 BC, and according to the ancient historian Herodotus, she came to power after her brother, the rightful pharaoh, was murdered by his own courtiers. Rather than accept it, she invited every man responsible to a celebratory banquet held in a magnificent underground chamber. When they were all seated, eating and drinking, she opened the floodgates and drowned them all alive. Then, according to the same account, she walked into a room filled with hot ashes and suffocated, denying any future avenger the satisfaction of her capture. Egyptologists today debate whether Nitocris actually existed. Some believe she was a mistranslation of a male king's name. But her story survived for thousands of years because it felt true to something ancient and essential. The specific patient fury of a woman with nothing left to lose. Wu Zichin. She began her life as a concubine ranked among the lowest tier in the Tang imperial court, and she ended it as the only woman in Chinese history to ever rule as emperor in her own name. The path between those 2 points ran through a great deal of blood. According to Tang historical records, Wu Zichin smothered her own newborn daughter and framed the reigning Empress Wang for the murder, having her rival demoted, imprisoned, and eventually executed, allegedly with her hands and feet cut off and her body stuffed into a wine jar. She then systematically dismantled every faction that threatened her, building a network of secret police her contemporaries called the cruel officials to surveil, torture, and eliminate enemies across the empire. She ruled as emperor of the Zhou dynasty from 690 to 705 AD, and in fairness to history, also reformed the civil service, promoted talented officials regardless of birth, and ran one of the most effective governments of the Tang era. That complexity is precisely what makes her so extraordinary. She was genuinely capable and genuinely monstrous in equal measure. Cleopatra VII. History remembers her as a seductress, which is exactly the image she carefully constructed and precisely why it's incomplete. Cleopatra VII was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, and a political operator of extraordinary precision who treated family members as obstacles to be removed. Her younger brother and nominal co-ruler Ptolemy XIII was drowned in the Nile in 47 BC after his forces were crushed by Julius Caesar, a Caesar whose alliance Cleopatra had personally secured by having herself smuggled into his presence rolled in a carpet. Her sister Arsinoe, who had the audacity to challenge her rule, was dragged from a temple in Ephesus and executed at Cleopatra's explicit request in 41 BC. She spoke 9 languages, governed a kingdom, commanded armies, and manipulated the 2 most powerful men in Rome. When it became clear that Octavian intended to parade her through Rome as a trophy in 30 BC, she died, by ass bite, by poison, or by some method still debated. On August 12th, 30 BC, denying him the spectacle entirely. Agrippina the Younger. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote about her with a combination of horror and something close to admiration, and it is easy to see why. Agrippina the Younger was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the sister of Caligula, the wife of Emperor Claudius, and the mother of Nero, which means she lived most of her adult life at the absolute center of the most dangerous court in the ancient world, and survived it through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural political instinct. She married her own great-uncle Claudius in 49 AD, convinced him to adopt her son Nero, and then poisoned him with a dish of mushrooms in 54 AD to place that son on the throne before Claudius could change his mind. When her rival Lollia Paulina was exiled, Agrippina was not satisfied. She demanded the woman's severed head be brought to her, and personally examined it to make sure it was genuine. Nero eventually decided his mother was too dangerous to live and sent assassins in 59 AD. According to Tacitus, as the men stood over her with drawn blades, she bared her abdomen and told them to strike her in the womb, the part of her that had produced the emperor now trying to kill her, Brunhilde of Austrasia. For nearly half a century, Brunhilde of Austrasia was the most feared political force in Frankish Europe, and her career was built almost entirely on a blood feud that began with her sister's murder. A Visigothic princess who married into the Merovingian royal family around 566 AD, she spent the following decades locked in relentless, escalating war with her rival Queen Fredegund, a conflict so prolonged and so vicious that it consumed the lives of the chronicler, Fredegard's estimated 10 Frankish kings caught between the 2 women. Brunhilde orchestrated assassinations, manipulated her grandsons onto thrones, served as regent across multiple kingdoms, and used the Frankish church and nobility as instruments in a game she played longer than most of her enemies lived. King Clothar II finally captured her in 613 AD when she was approximately 70 years old. He spent 3 days having her tortured before tying her limbs to 4 horses and driving them in opposite directions. What remained was burned. Empress Irene of Byzantium. She is the only woman in Byzantine history to rule the empire as sole emperor. Not empress consort, not regent, but basileus, the male title of supreme power, applied to herself by her own decree. Irene achieved this in 797 AD by having her own son, Constantine VI, blinded in the same purple chamber of the imperial palace where she had given birth to him. The blinding was performed so severely that he died of his wounds shortly afterward. She had already previously had his eyes partially damaged in an earlier power struggle before moving to eliminate him permanently. Her justification was that his rule had been ineffective and theologically unsound, but Byzantine chroniclers were under no illusions about her motives. She wanted power completely, and she took it in the most intimate and devastating way imaginable. The Pope in Rome used the vacancy she created to crown Charlemagne as Emperor of the West in 800 AD, effectively fracturing what remained of the Roman imperial idea. She was deposed in 802 AD and died in poverty on the island of Lesbos the following year. Isabella of Castile. She funded Christopher Columbus, completed the centuries-long Reconquista, and presided over the beginning of Spain's global empire. She also expelled every Jewish person from Spain in a single royal decree, and appointed the man who would become history's most infamous inquisitor. The Alhambra Decree, signed on March 31, 1492, gave Spain's estimated 200,000 Jewish residents 4 months to convert or leave, ending a community that had existed on the Iberian Peninsula for over 1,000 years. Tomás de Torquemada, whom she appointed Grand Inquisitor in 1483, oversaw a campaign of torture and execution against converted Jews, Muslims, and Protestants suspected of secretly practicing their original faiths. Historians estimate somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people were burned at the stake during her reign, though precise figures remain debated. Isabella framed every act of persecution as divine duty, which is perhaps the most chilling aspect of her reign. Not that she was cruel in spite of her faith, but that her faith was the mechanism through which the cruelty was organized and executed with bureaucratic precision. Mary I of England. She had 283 people burned alive at the stake in less than 4 years, which works out to roughly 1 burning every 5 days, and she did it in the name of restoring the Catholic faith her father Henry VIII had dismantled. Mary I became the first Queen Regnant of England in 1553 and immediately set about reversing the Protestant Reformation, a project that earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. One of the few royal epithets that requires no exaggeration. The burnings took place publicly at Smithfield and across England, designed to be witnessed as deterrent, and instead became rallying points that hardened Protestant identity for generations. She had her young cousin Lady Jane Grey executed in February 1554, 9 days after Jane had briefly occupied the throne, removing a Protestant figurehead who posed a permanent symbolic threat. Mary died in November 1558 at age 42, possibly of uterine or ovarian cancer, having suffered 2 agonizing false pregnancies that left her both physically devastated and politically mocked by a court that had never fully accepted her. Her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth inherited the throne, and the fires of Smithfield became the founding myth of English Protestant martyrdom. Catherine de' Medici. She was called Madame Serpent by her enemies and the Black Queen in pamphlets that circulated across Europe, and she earned both names methodically over 6 decades at the center of French power. An Italian-born Medici who married into the Valois dynasty at 14, Catherine de' Medici outlived her husband King Henry II, steered 3 of her sons onto the French throne in succession, and served as the real power behind the French court for most of the second half of the 16th century. Her most enduring act was the Saint. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 23rd to 24th, 1572, in which somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Huguenot Protestants were slaughtered in Paris in a single night, with the violence spreading across France over the following weeks, and killing an estimated 70,000 in total. Historians still debate how directly Catherine ordered the massacre versus how much she approved a plan already in motion, but her presence at court during the planning and her reported reaction, that it was a necessary measure, places her at the center of it. She died in 1589, having buried most of her children, survived more assassination attempts than she could count, and kept France from complete collapse for nearly 30 years through a combination of political marriage, calculated violence, and sheer endurance. Elizabeth Bathory. The trial records from 1611 survive in Hungarian archives, and they are extraordinary documents of horror. Witness after witness, including survivors, servants, and local villagers, describe the same things. Young women and girls lured to Chakteach Castle in the Hungarian highlands with promises of work, then tortured with needles driven under their fingernails, burned with heated metal, and in winter, stripped and doused with water outdoors until they froze to death. The Countess Elizabeth Bathory was tried for 80 confirmed murders, though a single witness account placed the total as high as 650, a figure historians treat cautiously but cannot dismiss entirely given the scale of the operation. She believed, or was reported to believe, that bathing in the blood of virgins would preserve her youth, a detail that passed so completely into legend that it eventually swallowed her real history, which was in many ways worse. She was too noble to execute. King Matthias II of Hungary had her walled into a suite of rooms in her own castle with narrow slits for food to be passed through, and there she died in August 1614, 4 years later, with no trial outcome other than permanent entombment. Elizabeth I of England. The Virgin Queen presided over one of England's golden ages, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of Shakespeare, the beginning of global exploration, and over a reign of considerable, often overlooked violence. She imprisoned her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, for 19 years on English soil before finally signing Mary's death warrant in 1587, driven partly by genuine fear of Catholic conspiracy and partly by the recognition that Mary alive was a permanent rallying point for every Catholic in Europe who wanted Elizabeth dead. The Catholic priest Edmund Campion was hanged, drawn and quartered in December 1581 as part of a broader suppression of Catholicism that historians estimate claimed the lives of several hundred recusants during her reign. In Ireland, the suppression of the Desmond rebellions between 1569 and 1583 and the subsequent Munster Plantation followed a scorched earth campaign so devastating that the poet Edmund Spenser, who witnessed it, wrote that the surviving Irish crept out of their hiding places looking like anatomies of death. Elizabeth managed her court through a system of cultivated devotion and sudden absolute disgrace, keeping advisors, suitors, and rivals permanently off balance for 45 years. She was formidable in every sense of the word, and the word includes terrifying. Ranavalona I of Madagascar. She ruled the island of Madagascar for 33 years, from 1828 to 1861, with such comprehensive brutality that historians estimate the island's population was reduced by as much as half during her reign, from approximately 5 million people to somewhere near 2.5 million, though figures vary considerably by source. Queen Ranavalona I expelled all European missionaries and traders in 1831, banned Christianity in 1835 on pain of death, and enforced that ban through mass executions in which Christians were thrown from cliffs, boiled alive, or burned. She used the traditional Malagasy practice of fanampuana, essentially unpaid forced labor, to build roads, palaces, and military fortifications at a death rate that decimated entire regions. She tested food for poison by forcing servants to eat it first, executing them if they became ill. Ambassadors and foreign visitors were received with extraordinary ceremony and then expelled or imprisoned when they became inconvenient. The outside world declared her mad. Her subjects called her the Great Glory. She died in her sleep in 1861, in her 80s, having never been deposed, never been invaded successfully, and never particularly cared what anyone beyond her coastline thought of her. Princess Nitocris of Egypt. The oldest name on this list comes from a civilization so ancient that by the time the Romans were building their empire, Nitocris had already been dead for 2,000 years. And yet her story was still being told, still being whispered about, still making people deeply uncomfortable. According to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in his Histories in the 5th century BCE, Nitocris was an Egyptian queen of the 6th dynasty, ruling around 2180 BCE during the chaotic twilight of the Old Kingdom. Her brother, the rightful Pharaoh, had been murdered by a faction of powerful noblemen who then, apparently without thinking through the consequences particularly carefully, placed his sister on the throne in his place. What they got was not a grieving woman they could easily manipulate. What they got was someone who spent what appears to have been a very calm, very deliberate period of time engineering one of the most theatrical acts of revenge in recorded history. According to Herodotus, Nitocris commissioned the construction of a great underground banquet hall, a space of golden lamplight and stone columns, built secretly with a channel connecting it directly to the Nile River. She then invited every nobleman involved in her brother's murder to a lavish celebration inside it, framing the event as a gesture of goodwill, a reconciliation feast, the kind of royal hospitality that a conquered woman might extend to the men who now controlled her. The guests came. They ate. They drank. And then, according to the account, Nitocris opened the channel, and the dark water of the Nile came flooding in through a hidden pipe, and she left the room, and every single person who had killed her brother drowned in a banquet hall underground, while golden cups floated on the rising black water around their feet. The story does not end there. Having completed her revenge, and apparently understanding perfectly well what came next, Nitocris reportedly walked into a room filled with hot ash and embers and suffocated herself, denying anyone the chance to punish her for what she had done. She chose her own ending on her own terms, the same way she had chosen everyone else's. Modern Egyptologists are deeply divided on whether Nitocris actually existed. Scholars, including Kim Ryholt, have argued that she may have been a legendary figure constructed from a misreading of ancient records, possibly confused with a male pharaoh named Necherker, and that the 6th dynasty simply may not have included a female ruler matching her description. Manetho, the Egyptian historian writing in the 3rd century BCE, also includes her in his list of rulers, but Manetho was working from sources that were already ancient in his own time, and errors compound across millennia. What is undeniable, regardless of her historical reality, is what her story represents, and why it survived. She is the first princess in recorded tradition to weaponize hospitality itself, to transform the most fundamental social contract, the shared meal, into an instrument of mass killing. Whether she was real or not, someone in the ancient world imagined her, told her story, and kept telling it for thousands of years. That says something important about what the ancient world feared a wronged woman might be capable of. Princess Tullia Minor of Rome. If Nitocris is a story preserved in the amber of ancient legend, Tullia Minor sits in a slightly different category. She appears in Livy's Ob Urbe Condita, one of the foundational texts of Roman historical tradition, written around the 1st century BCE, but describing events from the 6th century BCE, and Livy is a moralizing historian with a clear agenda, but he is not writing pure fantasy. Tullia Minor was the younger daughter of Servius Tullius, the 6th king of Rome, and her story is one of political ambition executed with a coldness that made even Roman historians, not a particularly squeamish group, visibly uncomfortable. The situation, as Livy describes it in Book 1, was this. Tullia Minor and her sister were both married to brothers, Lucius and Aruns Tarquinius. The elder sister was paired with the more aggressive Lucius. Tullia Minor was paired with the gentler Aruns. This arrangement apparently satisfied nobody because, according to Livy, Tullia Minor and Lucius Tarquinius recognized in each other a shared appetite for power that their assigned spouses simply lacked. What followed was the murder of both of their existing partners, Tullia's gentle husband Aruns and Lucius's more passive wife, clearing the field so that Tullia and Lucius could marry each other. With that consolidation complete, Tullia Minor began actively pushing her new husband towards seizing the throne from her own father, feeding his ambition, sharpening his resolve, providing the psychological force behind what became a coup. When Lucius Tarquinius, who would become known to history as Tarquinius Superbus, the Proud, moved against Servius Tullius, he had the old king thrown down the steps of the Senate house, bleeding and broken, into the street below. A wounded Servius Tullius staggered to his feet and began trying to make his way through Rome. Tullia, riding in her carriage through the city, received the news that her father lay dying in the road ahead of her. According to Livy, she did not stop. She ordered her driver to ride over him. The carriage wheels of his own daughter crushed the body of Servius Tullius in the street, and his blood stained the stone, and the road was afterward called the Vicus Sceleratus, the Street of Crime, a name that Roman tradition preserved for centuries as a marker of that moment. Livy's account is designed to function as a moral lesson about what unchecked ambition produces, and it is entirely possible that some details have been sharpened or invented for rhetorical effect. But the core of the story, a queen who participated in the violent removal of her father and whose name became synonymous with betrayal of the most basic human bonds, persisted through Roman memory as one of its foundational cautionary tales. Tarquinius Superbus became the last king of Rome, remembered as a tyrant, and when his dynasty was eventually expelled and the Republic was established, Tullia Minor's carriage ride was held up as the moral nadir that had made a new form of government necessary. She was not just a villain in a story. In Roman political memory, she was the reason everything had to change. Princess Roxana of Macedon. Roxana presents a problem that the other names on this list largely do not, which is that her violence is genuinely difficult to separate from what appears to have been straightforward survival in one of the most dangerous political environments in ancient history. She was a Bactrian princess, the daughter of a local chieftain named Oxyartus, and she became Alexander the Great's first and arguably most significant wife after he encountered her during his eastern campaigns, around 327 BCE. When Alexander died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BCE, the entire vast machinery of the empire he had built immediately began tearing itself apart, and Roxana, who was pregnant with what would be Alexander's only legitimate heir, found herself at the center of the resulting chaos. Her primary rival for influence over the succession was Statera Se, Alexander's second wife and a Persian princess, the daughter of the defeated King Darius III, and Statera's very existence represented a direct threat to Roxana's son's claim to power. According to ancient sources including Plutarch, Roxana's response was swift and complete. She lured Statera Sekashir, Ianchor's son, and her sister Drypetus to a meeting, reportedly using forged letters written in Alexander's name to establish trust, and had both women killed. The bodies, according to some accounts, were thrown into a well to conceal the evidence. In a single move, Roxana had eliminated the most credible rival bloodline to her unborn child's claim to the Macedonian succession. The boy, born shortly afterward, became Alexander IV, and for years, Roxana maneuvered through the brutal political landscape of the Wars of the Diadochi, the conflicts among Alexander's former generals, who were now carving up his empire like wolves over a carcass, trying to keep herself and her son alive and relevant. She ultimately failed. The general Cassander, who controlled Macedonia, had Roxana and Alexander IV imprisoned around 317 BCE, and both were executed sometime around 310 to 309 BCE, when Alexander IV was perhaps 13 years old. The question of how to categorize Roxana's murder of Statera is genuinely thorny. She killed a woman and her sister in cold blood using deception. She also did it in a world where the alternative was almost certainly her own death, and her child's erasure from history. The forged letters detail comes from ancient sources that need to be treated carefully, and some historians dispute aspects of the account. But the outline of events, a queen who killed her rivals immediately after her husband's death to protect her son's succession, is broadly accepted. Roxana is the entry on this list where the word evil feels least comfortable, not because the act was less violent, but because the calculus behind it is the most understandable. Princess Fredegund of the Franks. Fredegund is unique on this list in that she did not begin life as a princess at all. She was, by most historical accounts, a servant, possibly a slave, in the household of the Merovingian Frankish king Chilperic III, and the fact that she ended her life having outlasted virtually every enemy she ever made, having served as effective ruler of a kingdom, and having died peacefully of natural causes while her greatest rival was still alive and suffering, is either a testament to extraordinary ability or to the complete moral flexibility that comes with having nothing to lose and everything to gain. According to Gregory of Tours, the 6th century bishop and historian whose Historia Francorum is the primary source for this period, Fredegund's rise began with the removal of Queen Galsvintha, Chilperic's legitimate wife, who was allegedly strangled, possibly within days of her own wedding, so that Fredegund could take her place. Whether Fredegund directly ordered this or whether Chilperic acted on his own, and Fredegund was the beneficiary, is debated. But Gregory of Tours leaves little ambiguity about where he thinks the initiative originated. What followed over the next 2 decades was a relentless campaign of political violence that Gregory documents with barely concealed horror. Multiple sons of Chilperic from previous marriages died under circumstances that contemporary observers found suspicious. At least 2 assassination attempts were directed at Fredegund's nemesis, Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia, the sister of the murdered Galsvintha, who had every personal and political reason to want Fredegund destroyed, and who pursued that goal with equal intensity. The blood feud between these 2 queens became one of the defining conflicts of the Merovingian period, a decades-long war conducted through assassins, forged documents, shifting alliances, and occasional open battle. One of Fredegund's most chilling alleged operations, described by Gregory, involved sending 2 clerics disguised as beggars to assassinate King Sigebert of Austrasia, Brunhilde's husband, which succeeded. Sigebert was killed in 575 CE. Brunhilde survived, which meant the feud continued. When Chilperic himself was murdered in 584 CE, stabbed by an unknown assailant while returning from a hunt, Fredegund was among those suspected, though nothing was proven. Rather than collapse, she immediately assumed the role of regent for her infant son Clothar Thun and ruled Neustria with an iron grip for the next 13 years, executing enemies, managing the nobility, and waging war, before dying of natural causes in 597 CE. Gregory of Tours despised Fredegund, which is the critical caveat that has to accompany every piece of this account. He was a bishop writing about a woman he considered morally depraved, in a tradition that was deeply uncomfortable with female power, and some modern historians argue that his portrait is significantly distorted. But even accounting generously for his bias, the structural pattern he describes, a woman who systematically removed obstacles to her own power over a period of decades and was never successfully stopped, is coherent enough to carry weight. Princess Isabeau of Bavaria. Isabeau of Bavaria became Queen of France in 1385 when she married King Charles VI, and for the first years of the marriage, the future probably looked reasonably manageable. Then Charles VI began experiencing episodes of violent psychosis. In one early episode in 1392, he killed 4 of his own knights during a march before being restrained. He periodically forgot that he was king, forgot that he had a wife, and at his worst became convinced that he was made of glass and might shatter if anyone touched him, requiring special padded clothing to prevent him from what he feared was his own fragility. The machinery of French government could not simply stop, and into that vacuum, Isabeau moved, navigating the savage factional politics of a kingdom at war with itself between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, while simultaneously managing a husband who could not reliably recognize her. For a long period, she is described by historians, including Tracy Adams and Rachel Gibbons, as a serious political operator working in genuinely impossible circumstances, trying to hold France together while everyone around her was using the king's incapacity as an opportunity to grab power. What history has never forgiven her for is the Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420. The treaty, negotiated with Henry V of England and the Duke of Burgundy, following years of devastating civil war and military catastrophe, effectively signed away the French crown. Under its terms, Henry V would marry Isabeau's daughter Catherine. Henry would become regent of France during Charles VI's incapacity, and the French throne would pass to Henry and Catherine's heirs after Charles died, bypassing the French Dauphin entirely. To justify disinheriting her own son, the future Charles VII, the treaty included a clause declaring him illegitimate, which was a public claim that Isabeau had committed adultery, a charge that the vast majority of modern historians consider to have been political propaganda with no factual basis. Whether Isabeau believed the treaty was the only way to end a war that had been destroying France for decades, or whether she was coerced, or whether she made a cynical calculation about her own survival under an English-dominated French court, remains genuinely unclear. What is not unclear is that she signed a document disinheriting her own child on the basis of a lie about her own faithfulness, and handed the succession of France to a foreign king. Charles VI eventually reclaimed the French throne with considerable assistance from Joan of Arc, but Isabeau did not live to see what her treaty had set in motion, dying in 1435. She is the most politically complex figure in this video's lineup, a woman for whom even evil feels like too simple a word, and desperate might be more accurate, while acknowledging that desperation does not excuse everything. Princess Caterina Sforza. Caterina Sforza is the entry on this list where the line between ferocious and monstrous is most genuinely blurry, because she is also one of the most studied, most admired, and most written about women of the Italian Renaissance, a figure who appears in Machiavelli's discourses on Livy as an example of both courage and political calculation. She was born in 1463, the illegitimate daughter of Galeazzo Maria Sforza, Duke of Milan, and she received an education and upbringing unusual for women of her era, one that treated her as a serious political actor from childhood. She married Girolamo Riario, a nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, and became Countess of Forlì, a position she administered with considerable competence during a period when northern Italian politics were essentially a continuous low-grade war conducted through assassination, marriage, and mercenary armies. In April 1488, members of the Orsi family, Local nobles, with accumulated grievances against her husband's rule, murdered Girolamo Riario in a courtyard of the palace. They then seized Caterina's children as hostages and demanded she surrender the nearby fortress of Ravaldino, which was still held by her loyal garrison. What Caterina did next entered Renaissance legend almost immediately. She negotiated permission to enter the fortress herself, under the pretext of persuading the garrison to surrender. Once inside the walls and safely beyond reach, she climbed to the battlements, faced the conspirators and her hostage children across the open space between them, and reportedly lifted her skirts and told her enemies, in terms that left nothing to the imagination, that she had the means to produce more children and that they could do whatever they wished with the ones they held. Whether the exact words attributed to her by various contemporary chroniclers are precisely accurate is debated, but the gesture, the defiance, the complete refusal to be controlled through her children is attested in multiple sources from the period. The hostages were not harmed, possibly because the conspirators recognized that killing them gained them nothing without the fortress, and the fortress was beyond their reach. But Caterina's vengeance, when it came, extended well past justice into something that contemporaries described with a kind of appalled awe. The assassins were hunted down and killed, then their families were targeted, then their extended relatives. Wives, children, and household members connected to the Orsi conspiracy were killed in reprisals that went significantly beyond punishing the guilty and into the territory of collective punishment on a scale that shocked even a society accustomed to brutal political violence. Machiavelli, who actually met Caterina in 1499 on a diplomatic mission and wrote about her with clear admiration mixed with analytical wariness, considered her both an example of virtu, the Renaissance concept of bold, effective action, and a cautionary study in overreach. She was later captured by Cesare Borgia in 1500 when he conquered Forlì, and spent time as his prisoner, reportedly the only captive he treated with something approaching respect, which itself says something about how dangerous he considered her. She died in 1509, having outlived several enemies and never, by any account, fully losing the quality that defined her. She was simply not afraid of anything that happened to other people. Princess Anula of Anuradhapura. Most lists like this one draw entirely from European history, which misses a woman recorded in the Mahavamsa, the great Sri Lankan Buddhist chronicle compiled in the 6th century CE, but describing events from several centuries earlier, whose approach to royal marriage makes most European contenders look almost conservative. Anula of Anuradhapura is recorded in the Mahavamsa as the first female ruler in Sri Lankan history, and as a queen who maintained her position through what the chronicle describes as serial poisoning of her husbands, conducted across a reign of approximately 5 years, beginning around 47 BCE. The sequence, as recorded in the chronicle, is striking in its consistency. Anula allegedly poisoned Crown Prince Mahakuli, then took a palace guard named Siva as her consort, and made him king before poisoning him as well, then elevated a Tamil man named Vatuka to the same position with the same result, then a carpenter named Nilya, then others. The Mahavamsa presents the number of poisoned husbands at somewhere between 4 and 7, depending on which passage is being consulted, and the chronicle is explicit that she administered the poison herself in each case. What the chronicle finds equally, or perhaps even more outrageous, is that several of her chosen consorts came from outside the traditional royal caste, including the carpenter, and one was ethnically Tamil in a Sinhalese kingdom. The class and ethnic boundary crossing scandalizes the Buddhist chroniclers at least as much as the murders do, which is an informative window into what they found most threatening about her reign. Not just that she killed her husbands, but that she chose them herself from whatever background she preferred, treating the institution of royal marriage as a purely personal rather than political matter. Her reign ended when Kutakana Tissa, with the support of forces that had been gathering against her, overthrew her government and had her burned alive, a method of execution that the Mahavamsa records without apparent discomfort given the nature of her crimes as the chronicle understood them. The Mahavamsa is a religious text, written with clear political and dynastic purposes, and it was compiled centuries after the events it describes, so everything in Anula's story should be understood through that filter. But the level of specific detail, the named consorts, the described methods, the named successor, suggests that the chronicle is working from some historical tradition rather than inventing wholesale. She stands as evidence that the archetype of the lethal royal woman who eliminates inconvenient partners is not a European invention, or even a particularly regional one. It appears across cultures in ancient South Asia just as readily as in Rome, or the Frankish kingdoms, suggesting something universal about the intersection of confined power, royal succession, and the particular position of women within royal courts across ancient civilizations. Princess Maria Carolina of Naples. Maria Carolina of Austria was born in 1752, the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, which placed her in one of the most formidably capable female lineages in European history. She was also the sister of Marie Antoinette, a fact that would become the defining trauma of her political life and would ultimately transform her from a relatively reform-minded queen into something considerably darker. She became Queen of Naples by marriage to King Ferdinand IV in 1768, and in the early decades of her reign she worked to modernize the Neapolitan court, cultivate alliances, and reduce Spanish influence in her husband's government, functioning as a genuine political force in a kingdom. Her husband was notoriously uninterested in actually governing. Then 1793 happened, and her sister was guillotined in Paris, and something in Maria Carolina's political calculus appears to have broken in ways that never fully repaired. When the Parthenopean Republic, a short-lived French-backed revolutionary government, seized control of Naples in 1799, Maria Carolina was forced to flee by sea with her family. The Republic lasted only months before collapsing, and its end was overseen in part by the British Admiral Horatio Nelson, whose flagship enforced the restoration of Bourbon power in the Bay of Naples, with Emma Hamilton, Nelson's famous companion and a close personal friend of the Queen, serving as a conduit between the royal party and the British naval command. The reprisals that followed the Republic's collapse were extraordinary in their severity. Hundreds of Neapolitan Republicans, many of them aristocrats, intellectuals, and professionals who had participated in or supported the revolutionary government, were tried and executed. Among the most notorious cases was Admiral Francesco Caracciolo, a Neapolitan naval officer who had sided with the Republic, who was captured, court-martialed in a proceeding that lasted less than an hour, and hanged from the yardarm of his own ship in the harbor on June 29, 1799. When Caracciolo's body was later seen floating upright in the water near the royal vessel, Ferdinand IV reportedly joked that his admiral had come to pay his respects. Nelson's role in violating an armistice that had promised the Republicans safe conduct in order to allow the executions to proceed remains one of the most controversial episodes of his career. Maria Carolina's role in encouraging or directing the severity of the reprisals is debated by historians, with some arguing that she was the driving force behind the hardest measures and others placing more responsibility on Ferdinand and Nelson. What is not debated is that the restoration killed hundreds of people, many of whom had been promised safety, and that Maria Carolina did not object. She spent her remaining years increasingly at odds with Napoleon's reorganization of European power, was eventually exiled, and died in 1814. She is a figure whose story is inseparable from grief, from the image of her sister's execution, from the fear of what revolution meant for people like her, and that context does not excuse the deaths in the Bay of Naples, but it does make her something more than simply a cruel woman. She is a woman who let her terror become other people's death sentence, Princess Ranavalona I of Madagascar. Ranavalona is the most contested figure on this list, which is worth stating clearly at the outset because the historical record surrounding her is so thoroughly shaped by European colonial sources that untangling what she actually did from what Europeans needed her to have done in order to justify their own ambitions in Madagascar is genuinely difficult work. She became queen of the Kingdom of Imerina in 1828, following the death of her husband, King Radama I, and her first significant acts were to reverse virtually every policy of his reign that had opened Madagascar to European influence. Radama I had welcomed British missionaries, allowed the spread of Christianity, and entered into treaties with European powers. Ranavalona expelled the missionaries, banned the practice of Christianity under penalty of death, and made clear that she considered European presence in Madagascar a threat to be eliminated rather than an opportunity to be cultivated. The executions of Malagasy Christians that followed her edicts were real, and are documented in sources beyond the missionary accounts that form the bulk of European testimony. People were burned, thrown from cliffs, and boiled alive, with the specific method apparently chosen to reflect the severity of the transgression as Ranavalona's court understood it. The numbers killed are disputed, with different sources offering figures that range widely enough to suggest that nobody had reliable data, and that some accounts were significantly inflated for rhetorical effect. Far more destructive in demographic terms was the tangina ordeal, a form of trial by ordeal using the highly toxic tangina nut, which Ranavalona applied so extensively as a mechanism for identifying criminals, witches, and enemies that some modern estimates, which must be treated with significant caution, suggest the practice may have killed somewhere between a fifth and a third of the Malagasy population over the course of her reign. In 1845, a joint Franco-British naval force attacked the port of Tamatave in what was intended as a punitive demonstration of European power. Ranavalona's forces repelled the attack, and in Madagascar today, this event is remembered as a moment of national resistance, with Ranavalona sometimes framed as a defender of sovereignty against colonial aggression, which she was. These two things are simultaneously true. She successfully defended her country from European imperialism, and she presided over the deaths of an enormous number of her own people through executions and the Tangina ordeal. Her son Radama Xie, who took power when she died in 1861, reversed her policies within months, which suggests that even within Madagascar, there was a strong constituency that had found her reign extreme. Ranavalona is the entry on this list that most resists the simple label of evil, and most demands the more uncomfortable question of what framework we are using to judge, whose sources we are trusting, and whether a woman who killed thousands of her own subjects while successfully resisting European colonization can be evaluated by any single moral standard that does not immediately collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Ranavalona III and the end of an era. The last formally reigning queen of Madagascar was Ranavalona III, born in 1861, grandniece of Ranavalona I, and she represents something entirely different from every other figure on this list, which is why her story is the right place to end. She came to the throne in 1883, and she was not cruel. She was not a poisoner or an architect of massacres, or a signer of documents that betrayed her children. She was a serious, capable, reform-minded monarch who tried to modernize Madagascar while preserving its sovereignty, and she failed, not because of any moral failing on her part, but because the French decided in 1896 that they wanted Madagascar and had the military force to take it. She was exiled to Algiers, stripped of all power, and the Kingdom of Imerina ceased to exist as an independent political entity. She died in exile in 1917, having spent the last 21 years of her life as a person who had once commanded a kingdom and was now permitted no authority over anything. The reason her story belongs at the end of this particular list is that it marks a boundary. Every other woman described in this video operated in a world where individual royal figures could order executions, flood banquet halls, poison husbands, sign treaties that reshaped continents, and direct reprisals that killed hundreds of people, because in those worlds, power was personal. It lived in the bodies and decisions of specific individuals. A queen who wanted someone dead could make it happen. A princess with sufficient nerve and absolutely no compunction could remake the political landscape around her through sheer force of will and a willingness to do things other people found unthinkable. By the time Ranavalona III was exiled to Algiers, that world was effectively over. The machinery of violence had been industrialized and bureaucratized, moved out of the hands of individual monarchs and into the apparatus of nation-states, colonial administrations, and professional militaries. This did not make the world less violent. It made it vastly more violent, as the 20th century would shortly and catastrophically demonstrate. But it changed. Who could be personally, directly, individually terrible in the way that Fredegund or Caterina Sforza or Nitocris had been terrible? And the answer was, not queens anymore. The women on this list were feared because they had power, and they used it. And the things they did with it ranged from understandable to monstrous, depending on the circumstances and who was telling the story. But in every case, they were operating in a world where a single person's decision could end other people's lives with immediate, direct, personal consequences. That world produced figures of extraordinary ferocity. It also produced figures of extraordinary courage, and sometimes those were the same person. The most honest thing to say about all of them, from the woman who allegedly drowned a banquet hall in ancient Egypt to the queen who expelled missionaries from 19th century Madagascar, is that they were each, in their own way, exactly as ruthless as the systems they inhabited required them to be, and sometimes considerably more so. Joanna of Castile. She is often handed to us as a tragic romantic, a grieving widow driven mad by love. But the reality of Joanna of Castile is far more disturbing and far more politically complicated than any love story. Born in 1479 to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Joanna was heir to one of the most powerful thrones in the world, and by most accounts she was intelligent, educated, and politically capable. Her husband, Philip I of Burgundy, known as Philip the Handsome, died suddenly in September 1506, and what happened next became the foundation of her legend. Contemporary accounts describe Joanna refusing to allow Philip's coffin to be sealed, traveling with his corpse across the dusty roads of Castile, and reportedly opening the casket at intervals, whether out of grief, denial, or suspicion of foul play, depending on which account you believe. That image, a queen in black robes trailing a rotting coffin through the Spanish interior, became the defining portrait of her life. But here's the thing about that portrait. It was painted almost entirely by the men who had every reason to make her look unfit to rule. Her father Ferdinand moved quickly after Philip's death to declare her incapable of governing, and Joanna was taken to the castle of Tordesillas in Valladolid in 1509, where she would remain for the rest of her life, nearly 46 years, locked in increasingly dark and restricted conditions. Her son, Charles I, who would become Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and one of the most powerful men in European history, had every political incentive to keep his mother declared insane and tucked away. The conditions of her confinement, according to various historical accounts, deteriorated significantly over time, with reports of darkened rooms, limited food, and clergy sent at Charles's direction to psychologically torment her with religious ritual. Whether Joanna was genuinely experiencing a severe mental illness, or whether she was a politically inconvenient woman who was gaslit and imprisoned by the men around her, remains actively debated by historians today. What is not debated is that she was kept from ruling a kingdom that was legally hers, that the men who confined her used her supposed madness to justify consolidating enormous power for themselves, and that she died in that castle in 1555, having never been given the chance to govern. She is on this list not purely as a perpetrator, but as a case study in how royal evil works in multiple directions, and as a reminder that sometimes the cruelty flows from the throne inward, just as brutally as it flows outward. Maria Theresa of Austria. History has been extraordinarily generous to Maria Theresa of Austria, the Habsburg ruler who reigned from 1740 to 1780 as Queen of Hungary and Bohemia and Holy Roman Empress, and that generosity has involved a remarkable amount of looking away. The standard biographical treatment celebrates her as an enlightened reformer, a capable administrator, a devoted mother of 16 children, and a stabilizing force in turbulent European politics. All of that is broadly true. It is also true that she was a committed, documented, and explicitly stated anti-Semite who used the full power of her state apparatus to persecute Jewish people, and who refused to back down even when her own advisors, foreign dignitaries, and the Pope himself pushed back on her edicts. In December 1744, she ordered the expulsion of Jews from Prague, accusing them without credible evidence of having aided Prussian forces during the War of the Austrian Succession. Thousands of people were uprooted from homes and communities their families had occupied for generations. The expulsion was partially reversed by 1748, but only under significant economic pressure from merchants and foreign powers who pointed out that it was damaging Austria's trade, not because Maria Theresa had any change of heart. Her private correspondence on the subject of Jewish people is some of the most explicitly contemptuous writing produced by any European monarch of the 18th century. Language so harsh that it has made modern Habsburg historians visibly uncomfortable when they are forced to quote it directly. She wrote of Jewish people as a plague on her dominions, as deceivers, as people she wished entirely removed from her presence. These were not offhand remarks made in anger. They were considered policy positions she acted on repeatedly. Beyond her anti-Semitism, she also established what became known as the Kuschheits Commission, or Chastity Commission, an actual state agency active from roughly the 1750s onward, whose function was to surveil the private sexual lives of ordinary Viennese citizens, arrest people suspected of prostitution or adultery, and impose penalties on behavior the crown deemed morally impure. This was not a minor bureaucratic footnote. It was a secret police force for people's bedrooms, operating in one of Europe's most sophisticated capital cities. Her daughter was Marie Antoinette, and the cold, controlling letters Maria Theresa sent her daughter in France reveal a woman capable of real emotional cruelty in her most intimate relationships. The lesson of Maria Theresa is that competence and cruelty are not opposites. They can coexist in the same person, on the same throne, signing the same documents on the same desk on the same afternoon. Catherine de' Medici. Catherine de' Medici arrived in France in 1533 as a 14-year-old Italian girl marrying the future King Henry II, and she spent the next several decades being underestimated, sidelined, and quietly accumulating power until she had enough of it to reshape France in genuinely catastrophic ways. After Henry II died in a jousting accident in 1559, Catherine became the dominant political force in the French court, serving as regent during the reigns of her three weak and short-lived sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, essentially ruling France through them across one of the most violent periods in the country's history. She is most directly associated with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 23rd to 24th, 1572, one of the single bloodiest events in French history, in which thousands of French Huguenots, Protestant Christians, were slaughtered by Catholic mobs and royal troops in Paris and then across France in the weeks that followed. Estimates of the death toll range from 5,000 to as many as 30,000 people, depending on the source and the geographic scope counted, with streets in Paris running with blood, bodies thrown into the Seine, and entire Huguenot communities wiped out in provincial cities. Catherine's exact role in ordering or consenting to the massacre is one of the most debated questions in French historical scholarship. Some historians argue she directly ordered it. Others contend she initially opposed the killing, but gave consent once it began, and virtually no serious historian argues she bears no responsibility at all. She was there. She had the power to stop it. She did not. Beyond the massacre, Catherine ran what contemporary sources describe as a network of beautiful female courtiers used as political spies. A group called the Escadron Volant, or Flying Squadron, women deployed to seduce and extract sensitive information from political rivals and foreign ambassadors. She also carried the persistent reputation during her lifetime of being a poisoner, earning the nickname Madame La Serpente, though direct documentary proof of specific poisonings is limited and historians treat these accusations with appropriate caution. What is not in dispute is that her maneuvering helped ignite and prolong the French Wars of Religion, a series of devastating conflicts that tore French society apart across the second half of the 16th century, and that she wielded the instruments of state terror with a sophistication that reflected her Medici upbringing in full. Mary I of England. Mary I of England reigned for only 5 years, from 1553 to 1558, but she packed enough state-sponsored murder into that short window to earn a nickname that has stuck for nearly 5 centuries. Bloody Mary. The daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife Catherine of Aragon, Mary grew up watching her father dismantle the Catholic Church in England, annul her parents' marriage, declare her illegitimate, and execute people she knew. By the time she took the throne, she was in her late 30s, intensely Catholic, and absolutely determined to return England to Rome. What followed was a systematic, state-organized program of religious persecution, in which approximately 283 to 300 Protestant men and women were burned at the stake between 1555 and 1558. Their names and stories recorded in extraordinary detail by the Protestant martyrologist John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs, a text that shaped English Protestant identity for generations. Fox's account is not neutral. It was written to document and celebrate Protestant suffering under Catholic persecution, and that bias is worth acknowledging, but the underlying records of who was burned, when, and where are broadly corroborated by independent sources. The victims were not only prominent clergy, they included ordinary people, weavers, farmers, apprentices, tradespeople, men and women whose only crime was attending the wrong church. The most symbolically charged execution was that of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had helped Henry VIII break from Rome and who had annulled Mary's parents' marriage, a deeply personal enemy. Cranmer was burned at the stake in Oxford on March 21st, 1556, and in one of history's most theatrical final moments, he thrust the hand that had signed his recantation into the flames first, declaring it the offending hand and holding it there until it burned. Mary reportedly reviewed and personally approved many of the executions during her reign, making this not an out-of-control mob situation, but a deliberate royal policy. Her reign also brought military humiliation. England lost Calais to France in January 1558, its last continental territory, and Mary reportedly said on her deathbed that the word Calais would be found written on her heart. She also suffered at least 2 false pregnancies, a condition now understood as pseudocyesis, which left her emotionally devastated and politically weakened. She died in November 1558, succeeded by her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth, and her brief, bloody reign set a template for what religious state terror could look like that England would not soon forget. Isabella I of Castile. In the same year that Christopher Columbus sailed west under her sponsorship and stumbled into the Americas, Isabella I of Castile signed one of the most brutal religious edicts in European history, and the collision of those two facts in 1492 tells you almost everything you need to know about her. The Alhambra Decree, signed on March 31, 1492, ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Spain, giving Jewish people roughly 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave everything they had ever owned behind and go. Estimates of the number of people displaced range from 100,000 to 200,000. Communities destroyed, property seized, centuries of Iberian Jewish culture erased by royal decree. Those who converted were not safe either, because Isabella had already set the other great machinery of her reign in motion 14 years earlier. In 1478, she and Ferdinand obtained a papal bull establishing the Spanish Inquisition, with the stated purpose of investigating the sincerity of Jewish converts to Christianity, the conversos, who were suspected of secretly continuing Jewish practice. The Inquisition used torture systematically to extract confessions, and its first and most notorious Inquisitor General, Tomás de Torquemada, appointed in 1483, became synonymous with its most extreme methods. The number of people killed directly by the Inquisition under Isabella's reign is debated by historians, but the scale of suffering it caused through torture, imprisonment, public humiliation, and execution over its early decades was enormous. The same year as the Jewish expulsion and Columbus's voyage, Isabella also oversaw the final conquest of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, and subsequently the forced conversion or expulsion of Muslims from the newly unified Spain, dismantling a multicultural Iberian society that had existed for centuries. The ideological framework underpinning all of this was limpieza de sangre, blood purity, a concept of racial and religious cleansing that placed Catholic Old Christians at the top of the social hierarchy and targeted everyone else for varying degrees of persecution. Isabella is still celebrated in Spain and in many history books as the great unifier, the patron of exploration, the capable monarch who built a modern state. She was all of those things. She was also the architect of some of the most systematic ethnic and religious persecution medieval Europe ever produced, and those two versions of her are the same person. Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian is unique in all of Chinese recorded history, the only woman ever to say, rule China not as regent or consort, but as emperor in her own name, and the path she carved to that throne was paved with a level of ruthlessness that even her most sympathetic modern defenders struggle to fully rehabilitate. She entered the Tang imperial court as a concubine to Emperor Taizong, and after his death in 649 CE, she maneuvered herself into the household of his successor, Emperor Gaozong, eventually becoming his empress consort in 655 CE. The story that cemented her reputation is something beyond merely ambitious. The story that appears in the Old Book of Tang and the New Book of Tang compiled by later historians is that she smothered or strangled her own newborn daughter and then blamed the death on Empress Wang, the existing empress, in order to have Wang removed and destroyed. Modern historians approach this story with significant skepticism, noting that it appears in texts written by Confucian male scholars who considered female rule inherently illegitimate and had strong ideological reasons to paint Wu Zetian in the worst possible terms. But even setting that story aside entirely, what she did to Empress Wang and her rival consort Xiao after having them arrested is documented in the same historical sources with enough specificity to be taken seriously. According to the New Book of Tang, she had both women beaten until their hands and feet were cut off, then had their limbless bodies submerged in wine vats until they drowned. Whether or not you believe the infanticide story, that is what the record shows. After Gaozong's death in 683 CE, Wu Zetian ruled through and then displaced her own sons before formally declaring herself emperor of a new dynasty, the Zhou, in 690 CE. To maintain her hold on power, she built and operated an extensive secret police network that included bronze collection boxes placed in public where anyone could anonymously denounce anyone else. Informants were rewarded, and torture was used freely to extract confessions from the accused. She conducted systematic purges of the Tang imperial family, the Li clan from whose dynasty she had seized power, executing, exiling, or forcing the suicide of dozens of family members who might serve as rallying points for opposition. She reigned until 705 CE, when she was finally deposed at age approximately 81 in a palace coup while she was reportedly ill, and she died later that year. Here is where her story becomes genuinely complicated. She was also an extraordinarily effective administrator. She reformed the civil service examination system to promote talented people based on merit rather than aristocratic birth. She presided over a period of relative prosperity, and she expanded Tang territory. The evil and the competence were not separations of different phases of her life. They operated simultaneously, which is exactly what makes her so unsettling. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots has one of the most aggressively maintained victim narratives in all of European history, a beautiful Catholic queen, persecuted by her cold Protestant cousin Elizabeth I, imprisoned for 19 years, and finally beheaded in 1587. Her red martyrdom petticoat becoming one of history's most enduring symbols of royal suffering. That narrative is real. Her suffering was real. And it has been so successfully cultivated over the centuries that it has largely buried the other story, the one about her probable involvement in the murder of her own husband. Lord Henry Darnley, Mary's second husband, was killed on the night of February 9th to 10th, 1567, when Kirk of Field House in Edinburgh was destroyed by a massive explosion. Darnley's body was found in the garden, apparently strangled, having escaped the explosion only to be killed outside. The chief suspect almost immediately was James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, one of the most powerful men in Scotland, and a man with a very close relationship to Mary. Bothwell was acquitted in a trial so obviously rigged that foreign observers openly mocked it, and then, approximately 3 months after her husband's murder, on May 15th, 1567, Mary married Bothwell. 3 months. The marriage was so scandalous, so politically toxic, that it shocked even her Catholic allies across Europe who had been supporting her claim to the English throne. Her own lords rose against her almost immediately, and she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son James. The so-called casket letters, Chauffourchi, a collection of documents, including letters and love poetry allegedly in Mary's handwriting, surfaced in 1568 and appeared to show her foreknowledge of and participation in Darnley's murder. But the authenticity of those letters has been fiercely debated by historians for centuries, and the originals no longer exist. During her long imprisonment in England, multiple plots aimed at assassinating Elizabeth I and placing Mary on the English throne, including the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and finally the Babington plot in 1586, circulated around her name, and her level of knowing participation in the Babington plot specifically was the evidence Elizabeth's government used to justify her execution. At Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587, it took 3 blows of the axe to sever her head, and when the executioner held it up, her auburn wig came off in his hand, revealing close-cropped gray hair beneath. The martyrdom image stuck. The inconvenient questions largely did not. Ranavalona I of Madagascar. Ranavalona I ruled the Marina Kingdom of Madagascar from 1828 until her death in 1861, and across those 33 years she demonstrated a capacity for state-organized violence against her own people that was extraordinary even by the standards of absolute monarchy. She came to power through a palace coup immediately following the death of her husband, King Radama I, in 1828, with accusations, credible though not definitively proven, that she had poisoned him and forged his will to ensure her succession. Within the first years of her reign, she expelled European missionaries and traders from Madagascar, reversing the modernizing foreign policy of her late husband, and then went considerably further by making the practice of Christianity a capital offense. The persecution of Malagasy Christians that followed was systematic and public, designed not just to kill, but to terrify. Shown among the documented methods of execution used against Christians during her reign were burning alive and being thrown from the cliff at Ampamarinana, a site whose name translates roughly to the place of the hurling, a sheer rock face from which condemned people were cast to the ground below. The mass executions of 1849, which are the most extensively documented atrocities of her reign, saw dozens of Christians killed publicly in ways calculated for maximum psychological impact on the population. European accounts of these events are filtered through the lens of colonial missionary bias and should be read with appropriate skepticism about tone and framing. But the core facts of Christian persecution and mass execution by her direct order are not seriously disputed by modern historians. Beyond religious persecution, Ranavalona maintained a domestic forced labor system called Phantom Pawana, which functioned as state slavery for her own Malagasy subjects, compelling unpaid labor for construction projects, military campaigns, and royal enterprises with no compensation and severe punishment for noncompliance. Her military campaigns to suppress internal uprisings and expand Marina territory were conducted with scorched earth tactics that depopulated significant portions of the island. Some estimates suggest Madagascar's overall population declined substantially during her reign, though the precise figures are difficult to establish reliably from the available demographic record, and colonial-era exaggerations should be factored in. Her son Radama II came to power immediately after her death, and reversed virtually every major policy she had established, which itself tells you something about how her reign was experienced by those who lived through it. Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory is one of those historical figures who exists simultaneously as a documented criminal and a Gothic legend, and pulling those two things apart requires some care. Because the legend is so dramatically satisfying that it has largely colonized the history. What the documented record shows, based on witness testimony gathered in 1610 and 1611 proceedings against her and her accomplices, is disturbing enough without any embellishment. Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman born in 1560 who presided over Kastis Castle in what is now Slovakia, and she stands accused of systematically torturing and murdering young women and girls, primarily peasant girls lured to the castle with promises of paid work as servants. The testimony gathered from witnesses and survivors describes methods including burning with hot irons, mutilation of fingers and lips, biting flesh from living victims, forcing girls to stand outside in freezing winter temperatures until they died of exposure and prolonged starvation. The number of victims is one of the most contested elements of her case. The figure most commonly cited is 650, based on a claim that investigators found a register in Bathory's own handwriting listing that many victims, though the existence and precise contents of this register require careful sourcing, and some historians treat the highest figures with skepticism. A more conservatively sourced estimate based on witness testimony puts confirmed victims at approximately 80, with the probable total extending considerably higher. When investigators raided Kastis Castle in December 1610, they reportedly found bodies on the premises along with girls in various states of injury and dying, which provided the direct evidence for her arrest. She was never formally tried, almost certainly because the political and social complications of putting a powerful Hungarian countess on public trial were too significant for the authorities of the time to navigate. Instead, her accomplices, including a woman named Dorottya Shemtes, were tried, convicted, and burned at the stake, while Bathory herself was walled into a set of rooms in her own castle, Shum kept alive but entirely sealed from the outside world with only slits left open for food to pass through. She died in that walled room on August 21st, 1614. Now for the most famous part of her legend, the story that she bathed in the blood of virgin girls to preserve her youth and beauty. That story does not appear in the original 1610 to 1611 trial documents. It appears to originate in sources from the 18th century, written approximately 100 years after her death, and is almost certainly a later embellishment layered onto an already horrifying documented record. The real Elizabeth Bathory did not need supernatural evil to be monstrous. The testimony of the people who worked in her castle provided more than enough. Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina the Younger managed in a single lifetime to be exiled by one emperor, somebody married to another, and then murdered on the orders of a third. And the third one was her own son, which tells you a great deal about the kind of family she came from and the kind of world she operated in. Born around 15 CE into the heart of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, she was the sister of the Emperor Caligula, the niece and then wife of the Emperor Claudius, and the mother of the Emperor Nero, a sequence of relationships that reads like a family tree designed by someone who had given up entirely on normal dynastic arrangements. Her rise to power accelerated dramatically after she married her uncle Claudius in 49 CE, a union she is widely believed to have engineered herself, and once married to him, she moved systematically to position her son Nero as his heir, sidelining Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. On October 13th, 54 CE, Claudius died. According to the historian Tacitus in his annals, the biographer Suetonius, and the later historian Cassius Dio, Schillau, he was poisoned with mushrooms laced with a toxin prepared by a famous poisoner of the era named Locusta. None of these authors were eyewitnesses. Tacitus was writing approximately 60 years after the event. An ancient historical writing operated by different evidentiary standards than modern scholarship, but the consistency of the account across multiple independent sources has led most historians to treat the poisoning as probably genuine. Agrippina had Nero declared emperor the same day. For a brief period, she co-ruled alongside him, appearing on official Roman coinage alongside her son, in a near unprecedented assertion of female imperial authority, her portrait placed equal to or in front of his on certain coin issues. Sono a breathtaking piece of political symbolism in a society that had extremely defined ideas about where women belonged in the power structure. The partnership deteriorated as Nero consolidated his own confidence and began to resent her influence and her open threats to support rival claimants if he did not comply with her wishes. Nero, being Nero, decided the solution was murder. His first attempt was theatrical to the point of absurdity. A specially constructed boat designed to collapse and sink in the Bay of Baiae, crushing or drowning her in what was meant to look like a nautical accident. Agrippina survived by swimming to shore. Nero then simply sent soldiers to her villa, and according to Tacitus's account in the Annals, when the assassins arrived and drew their weapons, Agrippina bared her abdomen and told them to strike her womb, the womb that had given birth to such a son. That final line is almost certainly a rhetorical construction by Tacitus rather than her verbatim words. Ancient historians regularly invented deathbed speeches for dramatic effect, but whether she said it or not, it captures something true about the situation. She had built the monster standing at her door, and she knew it. Nero's reign following her death in 59 CE became one of Rome's most catastrophic, marked by the persecution of Christians, the execution of senators, the alleged burning of Rome, and finally his own ignominious death in 68 CE after being declared a public enemy. The evil of Agrippina the Younger did not end with her. It was, in the most literal sense, her greatest project, and it outlived her by nearly a decade of escalating disaster. Queen Mary, Saint of England. Queen Mary then is often remembered as the more sympathetic half of the William and Mary double act, a Protestant queen who co-ruled Britain with her Dutch husband and died young of smallpox at 32, but the genetic reality of her place in royal history is something that tends to get glossed over in favor of the political drama. Mary was the daughter of James II of England and his first wife Anne Hyde, and while that marriage was not itself consanguineous in any remarkable way, the dynasty Mary was born into had already been quietly threading its own bloodlines together for decades. Mary married her first cousin William III of Orange in 1677, a union that was not an accident of romance but a deliberate piece of political engineering by the English Parliament, which needed a Protestant heir and found one by pairing two members of the same extended Stuart family. Their shared great-grandparent was King James I of England, which placed their inbreeding coefficient at approximately 0.6, modest by the standards of what this video will go on to describe, but significant enough to mark them as a consanguineous couple by any clinical definition. The marriage was cold at first. Mary reportedly wept when she learned she was to marry William, finding the match neither romantic nor personally appealing, and William himself was famously private, reserved almost to the point of blankness, not the kind of man who warmed a room. Over time, they developed a genuine working partnership, but the union was always at its core a transaction, two Stuart-adjacent figures bolted together to solve a Protestant succession problem. What the marriage never produced was children. Mary suffered multiple miscarriages, and she died in December 1694 without a surviving heir, which meant the entire genetic and dynastic experiment of her marriage produced nothing forward into the family tree. Her death at 32 from smallpox was swift and devastating to the English court, and it accelerated the succession anxiety that would eventually produce the Act of Settlement in 1701, which rewired the entire British line of succession to exclude Catholics. Mary herself was a deeply religious woman, literate, thoughtful, and politically more capable than she is usually given credit for, often overshadowed in historical memory by the louder presence of her husband. Her inbreeding was mild. Her significance to this story is partly as a starting point, a baseline for what cousin marriage looked like when it was only one generation deep, before the compounding began. Queen Anne of Great Britain. Queen Anne sits just one step further along the same Stuart bloodline as her sister Mary, and her story transforms what was a quiet genetic footnote in Mary's case into something genuinely harrowing. Anne was the younger daughter of James II, born in 1665, and she married Prince George of Denmark in 1683, a match that brought in Scandinavian and North German Protestant royal blood that was itself the product of overlapping dynastic intermarriage across the Lutheran courts of Europe. The marriage was affectionate by royal standards, one of the more genuinely warm unions of the era, but what it produced biologically was catastrophic. Anne endured 17 pregnancies. 17. 12 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. 4 children were born alive but died in infancy. One child, William, Duke of Gloucester, survived long enough to seem like he might be the answer to England's succession prayers, reaching the age of 11 before dying in 1700, probably from complications related to hydrocephalus. After William's death, Anne never successfully carried another pregnancy to term, and she ascended the throne in 1702 as the last Stuart monarch, fully aware that she would leave no heir behind her. Modern medical historians have proposed several retrospective explanations for her reproductive catastrophe. The most discussed is antiphospholipid syndrome, an autoimmune condition that causes the blood to clot abnormally and is a well-documented cause of recurrent miscarriage. This hypothesis, which should be understood as a retrospective medical speculation rather than a confirmed diagnosis, gained some traction from the pattern of Anne's losses, which were consistent with placental thrombosis. Whether a genetic predisposition to such a condition was moving through the Stuart line is a question that cannot be answered definitively with the evidence available, but the concentration of reproductive failure across the Stuart women of this generation is striking enough that geneticists and medical historians continue to examine it. By the end of her reign, Anne was physically broken, grossly obese, barely able to walk, suffering from severe gout that left her confined to a wheelchair-like chair and carried by attendants. Her portraits from the final years show a woman who looked decades older than she was, her body worn down by repeated pregnancy, repeated loss, and what was almost certainly chronic pain. She died on August 1st, 1714, age 49, and her death ended the Stuart dynasty entirely, triggering the Hanoverian succession that would reshape British royal identity for the next century. Anne is often treated as a footnote between the Glorious Revolution and the Georgian era, but her story is one of the most personally devastating in this entire list. A woman who wanted heirs, tried repeatedly to produce them, and was failed at every turn by a body that the accumulated pressures of dynastic inbreeding may have already compromised before she even began. Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Joan the Mad, stands at the precise hinge point where this story turns from bad to catastrophic, because she is both a victim of royal inbreeding and the conduit through whom its worst consequences were transmitted forward into generations that would suffer far more than she did. Joanna was born in 1479, the third child of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and the problem starts right there, with her parents. Because Ferdinand and Isabella were second cousins whose marriage required a papal dispensation to proceed. The two most powerful monarchs in Spain were already sharing a significant portion of their genetic ancestry before Joanna was conceived. She then married Philip I of Burgundy, known as Philip the Handsome, in 996, a match that brought in Habsburg blood for the first time. And it is this fusion, Trastamara meeting Habsburg, that set the machinery of one of history's greatest genetic disasters into motion. Joanna's mental state has been debated by historians for centuries. She was declared unfit to rule by her father Ferdinand after Philip's death in 1506, a declaration that conveniently allowed Ferdinand to continue governing Castile, and she was then imprisoned at the castle of Tordesillas by her own son Charles III from approximately 1509 onward, where she remained for roughly 46 years until her death in 1555. Whether Joanna was genuinely mentally ill, whether she suffered from something that would today be diagnosed as a mood disorder or psychotic condition with possible hereditary components, or whether she was a politically inconvenient woman whose sanity was strategically undermined by the men around her, is a question historians have not resolved. Some scholars argue she showed clear signs of what might now be called severe depression or bipolar disorder from early adulthood. Others point out that almost everything we know about her madness comes from sources with a direct interest in portraying her as unfit. What is not in dispute is that she was the mother of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and that through Charles the genetic narrowing of the Habsburg line accelerated with each passing generation. Joanna lived to 75, outlasting almost everyone who had imprisoned her, and she died at Tordesillas on April 12, 1555, having spent nearly half a century in confinement. Her story is the pivot. Before Joanna, the inbreeding was present but manageable. After Joanna, and through the dynasty she founded with Philip, it would become something else entirely. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots is one of the most written about monarchs in European history. Her execution, her rivalry with Elizabeth I, her romantic disasters. But what tends to get less attention is her role as a carrier and transmitter of the dense genetic legacy of the Tudor-Stuart network, a network in which cousin marriage had become so normalized that her marriage to her own first cousin barely registered as unusual at the time. Mary was born in December 1542, the daughter of James the Freitarts of Scotland and Mary of Guise, and her father was himself a grandson of Henry VII of England, placing her squarely inside the tight family web of Tudor and Stuart royalty. Her first marriage, to Francis II of France, connected her to the Valois dynasty, a French royal line with its own documented pattern of early deaths, physical fragility, and possible hereditary health conditions, and it produced no children before Francis died in 1560. Her second marriage, to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in July 1565, was the one that mattered genetically, because Darnley was her first cousin, the son of her father's sister, Margaret, and the union was close enough to raise eyebrows even in a court accustomed to consanguineous matches. Contemporary accounts describe Darnley as tall, physically striking, and deeply unstable, prone to erratic behavior and what observers called weakness of character, though whether any of this reflected inherited biological factors or simply personal failings is impossible to say with confidence. Their son, born in June 1566 and crowned James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, inherited a concentrated genetic package from both parents and through them from all the overlapping Tudor and Stuart lines behind them. James Isciti showed signs of physical weakness throughout his life, including what some historians have described as rickets-like symptoms in childhood, difficulty walking steadily, and a tongue reportedly too large for his mouth. And a contested but recurring theory among medical historians proposes that the Stuarts may have carried a genetic predisposition to acute intermittent porphyria, a hereditary metabolic disorder that can cause neurological and psychiatric symptoms. This theory is disputed and should not be treated as established fact, but it has been taken seriously enough to appear in peer-reviewed medical historical literature. Mary herself was executed on February 8, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle, on the orders of Elizabeth I, and her death closed one chapter of her story, while the genetic thread she had woven through James continued forward into the next century and beyond. Catherine of Austria. Catherine of Austria was the daughter of Joanna of Castile and Philip II, which means she entered the world already carrying the fused Trastamara-Habsburg genetic heritage at its first generation of combination, and the marriage that awaited her would fold that heritage back on itself with devastating results. Born on January 14th at the 1507, Catherine married John III of Portugal, and this was not simply a match between two royal houses. It was a double union, conducted simultaneously, with John's sister Isabella marrying Catherine's brother Charles V. A bilateral exchange of royals that crossed and recrossed the same family lines in a way that made the resulting genetic overlap between Catherine and John far greater than any simple dynastic label would suggest. They shared ancestry through multiple lines, and the children that resulted from this union bore the consequences. Catherine and John III had either 8 or 9 children together, sources differ slightly, and of those children only one, Maria Manuela, survived to adulthood. The others died in infancy or early childhood, a mortality rate so far above the already high baseline of 16th century child death that it demands an explanation beyond bad luck and poor medicine. Modern geneticists who have studied the Iberian Habsburg line have proposed that the accumulation of recessive lethal alleles, genes that in a single copy are harmless, but in the double copy produced by inbreeding become fatal, is the most coherent explanation for this pattern of infant and child death. Catherine would have watched her nursery empty out repeatedly, child after child dying before reaching an age where they could be educated or betrothed, or used in the dynastic games that gave royal children their only sanctioned purpose. Her surviving daughter Maria Manuela would marry Philip II of Spain and die at 18, and through that death Catherine became the grandmother of Don Carlos, one of the most notorious examples of inbreeding's physical and psychological consequences. Catherine served as regent of Portugal during her grandson Sebastian's minority, demonstrating real political ability in the management of a kingdom whose dynasty was quietly destroying itself from the inside. She died on February 12, 1578, having outlived nearly every child she had carried. Maria Manuela of Portugal. Maria Manuela of Portugal had the misfortune of being the sole survivor of Catherine of Austria's devastated nursery, the one child who made it through childhood in a family where almost none did, and her survival brought her not safety, but a marriage that compressed the already extraordinary inbreeding of her lineage into something almost geometrically extreme. Born on October 15, 1527, Maria Manuela was the daughter of Catherine of Austria and John III of Portugal, two people who were already double cousins. She then married Philip II of Spain in 1543, and Philip was her first cousin on both sides simultaneously. Their shared ancestry ran through Joanna of Castile on both maternal and paternal lines, through Ferdinand and Isabella, through Philip I, creating a genetic loop with almost no external contribution from outside the same small group of interconnected ancestors. The inbreeding coefficient produced by this union was among the highest yet achieved by deliberate dynastic policy in European history. Maria Manuela was 16 when she married and 18 when she died, and she died on July 12, 1545, just 4 days after giving birth to a son who would be named Don Carlos. The likely cause of her death was postpartum hemorrhage, though the precise mechanism is not definitively documented, and some historians have speculated that underlying clotting disorders with hereditary components may have worsened her condition. Don Carlos, the child she died producing, grew into one of the most discussed examples of royal inbreeding's human cost, displaying severe physical abnormalities including a notably asymmetric body, a larger head than was typical, and behavioral instability so extreme that his own father eventually had him imprisoned, where he died in 1568 under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Maria Manuela herself is a figure who tends to disappear behind the more famous stories of Philip II and Don Carlos. But her death mattered structurally because it removed a genetic branch that might have introduced at least a marginal degree of variation, leaving Philip II free to compound the inbreeding further through his subsequent marriages, which he did repeatedly. Anna of Austria, Queen of Spain. Anna of Austria became the fourth wife of Philip II of Spain in 1570, and the fact that she was his niece, the daughter of his cousin and frequent correspondent, Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II, required a special dispensation from Pope Pius V before the marriage could proceed. Even by Habsburg standards, the closeness of this match was notable. Anna had been born on November 1st, 1549, the daughter of Maximilian II and Maria of Austria, both of whom were Habsburgs, meaning she arrived at her marriage to Philip already carrying a high inbreeding coefficient entirely independent of his own, and the combination of the two pushed the resulting children into genetic territory that was, in retrospect, deeply dangerous. Anna had originally been betrothed to Philip's son Don Carlos, before Don Carlos's imprisonment and death removed him from the picture, after which she was redirected to the father instead, a reshuffling that illustrates with bleak clarity how purely transactional the Habsburg approach to marriage had become by this point. A woman could be moved from son to father like a chess piece, the specific relationship mattering far less than the maintenance of Habsburg to Habsburg connection. Anna and Philip had 5 children together, of whom only one, the future Philip III, survived to adulthood. The 4 who died did so in infancy or childhood, maintaining the grim pattern that had run through this dynasty's nurseries for generations. Anna herself died on October 26, 1580, age 30. Her death most likely a combination of influenza and the physical toll of repeated childbirth on a body that had been producing and losing children throughout her 20s. Philip III, the one survivor, was born in 1578 and would inherit not just the Spanish throne, but an inbreeding coefficient that was already among the highest in Europe, a starting point from which his own dynastic choices would push his children still further along the same trajectory. Anna of Austria is the clearest illustration of how the Habsburgs used the aunt-uncle-niece-nephew category of marriage, not as a shocking exception, but as a routine tool, generation after generation, treating the papal dispensation required as an administrative formality rather than a moral signal to stop. Margaret of Austria, Queen of Spain. Margaret of Austria was born on December 25, 1584, a princess of the Austrian Habsburg line, and her marriage to Philip III of Spain in 1599 continued the practice of connecting the Austrian and Spanish branches of the family that had been the cornerstone of Habsburg dynastic policy for most of the previous century. She and Philip III were second cousins by the simplest accounting of their relationship, but given the layers of intermarriage that had taken place across every preceding generation, the actual genetic overlap between them was substantially greater than that label suggests. A family tree that should spread outward with each generation instead kept looping back to the same small cluster of ancestors, and Margaret and Philip were another knot in that loop. What their marriage produced, reproductively speaking, was relentless. Margaret gave birth to 8 children in 11 years, a pace that by itself would have been physically punishing for any woman, and it proved fatal. She died on October 3, 1611, aged 26, following complications from the birth of her last child. 8 children, 11 years, dead at 26. Among those children was the future Philip of the born in 1605, who would grow up to become the father of Charles II of Spain. The figure at the end of this story, whose name has become almost synonymous with the consequences of everything this dynasty had been doing to itself for a century and a half. And Margaret was, by the accounts of those who knew her, an intelligent and pious woman with genuine political interests, someone who engaged with the governance of the empire she had married into rather than retreating entirely into domestic life. She was also functionally a reproductive instrument of dynastic policy, her body deployed in service of an heir-producing project that killed her before she reached her late 20s. Philip IV grew up without her, raised in the rigid and increasingly airless culture of the late Habsburg court, shaped by an environment that had been narrowing genetically and culturally for generations. The line between Margaret and Charles II runs straight through Philip IV, and every link in that chain was forged by the same deliberate inbreeding that Margaret herself was both a product and a producer of. Mariana of Austria, Queen of Spain. Mariana of Austria was born on December 22, 1634, a daughter of the Austrian Habsburg line, and her path to becoming Queen of Spain followed one of the more disquieting detours in royal matrimonial history. She had originally been intended to marry Balthazar Carlos, the son of Philip IV of Spain, a match that would have been a standard continuation of the Austria-Spain dynastic linkage. When Balthazar Carlos died unexpectedly in 1646, the Spanish court did not look outward for a replacement match. It looked inward. Mariana was redirected to marry Philip IV himself, her intended husband's father and her own uncle, a union requiring the now routine papal dispensation that Habsburg matrimonial policy seemed to generate with industrial regularity. She was 14 at the time of the betrothal. Philip was 41. They married in 1649. The marriage produced several children, of whom the one who survived to adulthood and to the throne was Charles, born November 6, 1661, the child who would become Charles II of Spain. The genetic contribution Mariana made to Charles was catastrophic, not because of anything unusual about her as an individual, but because she was herself the product of generations of Habsburg intermarriage in the Austrian line, meaning that when her genes combined with Philip IV's, which carried the equally inbred Spanish Habsburg heritage, the result was a child whose ancestry had been compressed and folded back on itself to a degree that had no real precedent in documented history. After Philip IV's death in 1665, Mariana served as regent for the young Charles II, and she was a more capable political operator than she is usually given credit for. She navigated factional court conflicts with real skill, managed the weight of governing a global empire through a period of military and economic decline, and survived attempts by court rivals to exile her from power, which they eventually succeeded in doing temporarily before she partially recovered her influence. She lived until May 16, 1696, long enough to watch her son's reign become the embodiment of dynastic collapse, and she died knowing that the genetic consequences of everything her family had deliberately chosen across 5 generations were fully visible in the man sitting on the Spanish throne, Charles II's queens, and the end of a dynasty. The 2 women who married Charles II of Spain, Marie-Louise of Orleans and Maria Anna of Neuburg, were the final queens of the Spanish Habsburg line, and the story of their marriages is really the story of what happens when the cumulative weight of generations of deliberate inbreeding produces a human being who is biologically incapable of continuing the dynasty that created him. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient has been calculated at approximately 0.24, a figure produced by geneticists at the University of Santiago de Compostela in a 2009 study published in the journal PLOS ONE, authored by Alvarez, Ceballos, and Quintero. To understand what 0.254 means in concrete terms, a child born to two full siblings would have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Charles II, the product of uncle-niece marriage layered on top of generations of cousin and double cousin marriages, was genetically almost equivalent to the offspring of a sibling union, except that his parents were not siblings. They were simply the endpoint of a dynasty that had been recycling its own genes for so long that the distinction had almost ceased to matter. 16 of his 32 great-great-great-grandparents were the same individual. Every branch of his family tree that should have diverged outward into different bloodlines instead looped back to the same small group of ancestors, most of them traceable to Joanna of Castile and Philip III, the couple at item 3 of this video, who set the whole process in motion. The physical consequences were extensive and well documented. Charles could not chew solid food properly because the Habsburg jaw, a prognathism that ran through the family but in him reached its most extreme expression, left his lower jaw so prominent that his teeth did not meet. Contemporary accounts describe him as drooling frequently because his tongue was reportedly too large for his mouth to contain comfortably. He was unable to walk steadily in childhood and was delayed in nearly every developmental milestone. He suffered from what a 2009 medical retrospective proposed may have been a combination of pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, conditions that together would explain his short stature, physical weakness, cognitive difficulties, and infertility, though this analysis is a retrospective hypothesis and not a confirmed diagnosis. He was expected to die as an infant and was treated as a perpetual invalid by the court around him, yet he survived to the age of 38. Marie-Louise of Orleans, born in 1662, was the first woman brought in to try to produce an heir from this biological circumstance. She was a French princess, a granddaughter of Louis XV, and she arrived in Madrid in 1679 at the age of 17 to find a court that was rigidly ceremonious, stifling in its formality, and centered on a husband whose physical condition she found, by all accounts, deeply distressing. Contemporary letters and diplomatic reports describe her as miserable in Madrid, missing the lighter culture of the French court, trapped in a marriage that was personally repellent and dynastically feudal. She died on February 12, 1689, aged 26, without having produced a child, and the circumstances of her death generated rumors of poisoning that have never been substantiated and should be treated as unverified. Maria Anna of Neuburg, born in 1677, became Charles's second wife later that same year. Another attempt to solve the infertility problem by changing the woman rather than acknowledging that the problem was structural and irreversible. Maria Anna was also unable to conceive with Charles, confirming what the medical reality of his condition had made almost certain, and she outlived him by 4 decades, dying in 1740 having spent 40 years as the widow of the most biologically compromised monarch in documented European history. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700 without an heir, and his death immediately triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that drew in every major European power and ultimately reshaped the continent's political geography. The Spanish Habsburg line was extinct. The dynasty that Ferdinand and Isabella had built, that Joanna of Castile had transmitted to the Habsburgs, that Charles V had expanded into a global empire, that Philip II had governed at its height, and that 6 generations of deliberate consanguineous marriage had slowly hollowed out from the inside, ended with a man who could not chew his food, could not produce an heir, and could not walk across a room without difficulty. The consequences of that ending, the war it caused, the treaties it produced, the way it redistributed European power, were geopolitically significant enough that the inbreeding of the Spanish Habsburg line might be the single most consequential act of dynastic self-destruction in the history of organized states. Empress Dowager Zhao of Qin. Before the first emperor unified China under the Qin banner, before the terracotta armies were buried and the Great Walls were joined, the Qin court was already a place where power was purchased in blood, and the woman at the center of its most explosive scandal was Zhao Ji, the queen mother, the woman who gave birth to the man who would become Qin Shi Huang. Zhao Ji had spent years as a political pawn, originally a concubine associated with the merchant Lu Bue, before being passed into the royal household, a transaction that would fuel whispers about the first emperor's true parentage for the rest of his life. When her husband King Zhuangxiang died in 247 BCE, leaving behind a young son on the throne and a court full of wolves, Zhao Ji was left in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. What she did next, according to Sima Qian's Shiji, The foundational historical record written roughly a century after these events was take a lover named Lao Ai, a man introduced to the court under the fraudulent cover of being a eunuch, complete with forged documentation. Lao Ai was not subtle about his position. He fathered at least 2 children with the Queen Mother, and reportedly boasted in private company about his intimacy with her. When the young king, now approaching his majority, began to consolidate real power, Lao Ai recognized that his days of influence were numbered, and in 238 BCE he made a catastrophic gamble, attempting a coup using the Queen Mother's own royal seal to mobilize troops. The rebellion collapsed quickly. Lao Ai was captured and executed by the method known as carriage tearing, his body pulled apart by horses in 5 directions, and the destruction extended outward in waves, with his entire clan exterminated to the 3rd degree of relation. The 2 infant children Zhao Ji had borne him were reportedly killed as well, though Sima Qian's account of this detail should be read with caution, given the obvious incentive later Han historians had to blacken the Qin dynasty's reputation. What is less disputed is what happened to Zhao Ji herself. Her own son placed her under house arrest, confining her to her palace in what amounted to a living burial. She remained there until court advisors, calculating the political optics of a king who imprisoned his own mother, persuaded Qin Shi Huang to reinstate her. He did, but the relationship never recovered warmth. The Lao Ai scandal did something that echoed for 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history. It established, in the most visceral terms possible, that female sexuality inside the palace was not merely a private matter, but a national security threat, a vector for sedition, a weapon. Every subsequent system of palace surveillance, every rule about eunuchs, every restriction on who could enter the empress's quarters, traces a philosophical line back to this scandal and the chaos it unleashed on the Qin court. Empress Lu Zhi. If you asked any educated person in imperial China to name the most dangerous woman in their history, there is a reasonable chance they would say Empress Lu, and they would say it without hesitation. Lu Zhi was the wife of Liu Bang, the peasant-born founder of the Han dynasty, a man who defeated the Qin and the rival Chu to build one of the longest-lasting empires in world history. Lu Zhi had been at his side through the worst of it, including a period when she was captured by the rival Xiongnu forces and held as a prisoner of war, while her husband continued campaigning rather than negotiating for her release. That experience, the abandonment, the captivity, the years of hardship while Liu Bang charmed and schemed his way to the dragon throne, forged something in Lu Zhi that was past ordinary bitterness and into something colder and more deliberate. When Liu Bang died in 195 BCE, his court knew immediately that the woman now holding power as Empress Dowager was not going to be manageable. Her first target was Lady Qi, the emperor's favorite concubine, a woman Liu Bang had openly preferred and had seriously considered making the mother of his heir. Lu Zhi had Lady Qi's son, Liu Ruyi, poisoned. She lured the boy to the capital under false pretenses of friendship and administered the poison when her own son, the new Emperor Hui, was not present to protect his half-brother. Then she turned to Lady Qi herself, and what she did to her became one of the most infamous acts of cruelty recorded in all of Chinese imperial history. According to both the Shiji and Bangu's later Book of Han, Lu Zhi had Lady Qi's hands and feet amputated, her eyes gouged out, her ears pierced with a substance that destroyed her hearing, and forced her to drink a potion that robbed her of speech. She then had the resulting figure placed in a latrine pit and named her, with deliberate contempt, the human swine, or Renji in Chinese. She then summoned her own son, the reigning Emperor Hui, to come and look at the human swine. He came. He looked. He recognized Lady Qi. He reportedly wept for days, then told his mother that this was not something a human being could have done, and proceeded to drink himself into a state of permanent illness from which he never recovered, dying young, possibly in 188 BCE, possibly hastened by what he had seen. After Hui's death, Lu Zhi placed a series of infant emperors on the throne in succession, each young enough that she held all real power as regent. She systematically packed the court with members of her own Lu family, granting them noble titles and military commands in open defiance of the founding compact that Liu Bang's old generals had sworn, the agreement that only men of the Liu bloodline could hold kingdoms. The Liu clan's elevation was not just nepotism, it was a structural threat to the dynasty itself. When Lu Zhi died in 180 BCE, the response was immediate and total. The Liu loyalists in the military moved within weeks, killing every senior Liu clan member they could find. The purge was thorough. Her legacy was so radioactive that historians of the time actually debated whether she should appear in the basic annals of the Han, the sections traditionally reserved for emperors, which tells you everything about how the court understood what she had been. She was both a monster and a capable state administrator who kept the Han frontier stable, avoided expensive wars, and maintained the bureaucratic machinery Liu Bang had built. Both things were true simultaneously, and that combination is what makes her genuinely terrifying. Empress Jia Nanfeng. Empress Jia Nanfeng is responsible, more than almost any other individual in Chinese history, for triggering a civil war that killed millions of people and ended an entire era of northern Chinese civilization. She did not intend this. She intended to survive and to rule and to keep her position at the center of a court built around an emperor who was almost certainly intellectually disabled. Emperor Hui of the Western Jin dynasty is recorded in the Jinshu as having responded to a report of nationwide famine by asking with apparent sincerity why the starving people did not simply eat meat. Into this power vacuum stepped Jia Nanfeng, who is described in the historical sources as physically plain, temperamentally violent, and jealously possessive, descriptions that carry a heavy load of misogynist convention, but are consistent enough across sources to suggest at least some factual basis for her fearsome reputation. Her first major act of political violence came in 291 CE, when she engineered the destruction of Yang Jun, the regent who had controlled the court since Emperor Hui's accession. Yang Jun's entire extended family was executed, with contemporary sources claiming the death toll ran into the thousands, a figure that may be exaggerated but points toward a massacre of extraordinary scale. She then turned on Empress Dowager Yang, the emperor's stepmother, and had her locked in a sealed room and starved to death. What followed was nearly a decade of genuine, if brutal, political competence. Jia Nanfeng played the rival princes of the Jin royal family against each other with considerable skill, keeping any single faction from gaining enough power to displace her. Then she made the mistake that ended everything. The crown prince Sima Yu was popular, had the loyalty of the military, and represented a direct threat to her continued dominance because he was not her son. She forged an imperial edict, attributed it to him, used it to have him formally deposed for treason, and when it became clear that public sympathy for the prince was not fading, she had him poisoned with drugs concealed inside a jujube. This was the act that broke the court. Prince Zhao staged a coup in 300 CE, arrested Jia Nanfeng, and executed her by forcing her to drink gold-infused wine, a traditional method of execution for high-status prisoners that was considered marginally more dignified than beheading. Her death did not restore order. It opened the gates. The War of the Eight, princes that followed, lasted from 291 to 306 CE, consuming the Jin dynasty's military strength, depopulating entire regions of northern China, and leaving the frontier defenses so weakened that the non-Han peoples who had been settled inside the borders, the Xiongnu, Xianbei, Jie, Di, and Qiang, began seizing territory. The result was the chaos of the Five Barbarians, the loss of all of northern China, and the permanent division of the country for nearly 3 centuries. Jia Nanfeng did not cause all of this alone, but the murder of the crown prince was the specific act that made reconciliation within the Jin royal family impossible, and the chain of consequences runs directly from that jujube to the drowning of northern Chinese civilization. Empress Dowager Feng of Northern Wei. Empress Dowager Feng, known posthumously as Empress Dowager Wenming, is one of the most paradoxical figures in this entire list. A woman accused of murder, adultery, and political ruthlessness, who simultaneously oversaw some of the most consequential and genuinely beneficial administrative reforms in Chinese history. Northern Wei was a dynasty founded by the Xianbei people, a nomadic group from the northeastern steppe, and Empress Feng was ethnically Han Chinese, a fact that saturated every aspect of her political life. She first became regent after Emperor Wencheng's death in 465 CE, was then sidelined by court factions, and responded to her political vulnerability by taking a lover from among the court officials, a scandal that followed her for the rest of her life and gave her enemies permanent ammunition. When Emperor Xianzhu died young and under suspicious circumstances in 476 CE, historians have noted the suspicious convenience of his death for Empress Feng's return to power, though direct evidence of her involvement remains absent. She became regent for her young grandson, the boy who would become Emperor Xiaowen, and this second regency is where her historical legacy was made. She oversaw the Taihei reforms, a sweeping program of Sinicization that replaced Shanbei tribal customs with Chinese bureaucratic structures, implemented the equal field land distribution system known as Juntian, standardized Chinese dress and language at court, and restructured the tax system in ways that brought significantly more stability to the Northern Wei state. Emperor Xiaowen, who would continue and deepen these reforms after her death, revered her completely. But the path to that legacy was built on corpses. She had rivals within the Tuoba royal clan executed, maintained networks of young male favorites whose influence over court appointments caused resentment and institutional corruption, and is alleged in some sources to have had Emperor Xianzu's biological mother, Lady Li, killed by forcing her to drink wine until she died, securing her own uncontested position as the grandmother regent. She died in 490 CE after nearly 2 decades of effective rule, and the tension in how to evaluate her as a reformer who modernized a dynasty versus a politician who killed her way to the top and ran a corrupt patronage network has never been fully resolved. She is a reminder that in the ruthless mathematics of imperial succession, the same person can be both the best thing that happened to an institution and a genuinely dangerous human being. Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian is the only woman in all of Chinese imperial history to rule as emperor in her own name, and the story of how she got there is so improbable and so soaked in both genuine achievement and documented brutality that it reads more like mythology than biography. She entered the Tang court at approximately 14 years old as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, one of the most celebrated rulers in Chinese history. When Taizong died in 649 CE, court protocol required that his concubines who had not borne children be sent to Buddhist convents to spend the rest of their lives as nuns. Wu Zetian went, and then somehow she came back, catching the attention of Taizong's son, the new Emperor Gaozong, who elevated her first to favored concubine, and then, controversially and over enormous aristocratic objection, to Empress in 655 CE. What happened to the previous Empress Wang, and to the Xiao consort who stood in Wu Zetian's way became the story that defined her reputation for cruelty. According to Tang sources, after Empress Wang and Consort Xiao were deposed and imprisoned, Wu Zetian had their hands and feet cut off and their bodies submerged in wine vats. Whether she had previously smothered her own infant daughter and blamed the death on Empress Wang to engineer the deposition is one of the most contested questions in Tang historiography. The story appears in the Old Tang Shu, but modern historians note that it was written with obvious hostile intent, and may be a fabrication designed to paint the eventual female emperor as a murderous mother. What is not contested is that as Gaozong's health declined and she assumed more of his governing functions, she developed an extraordinarily sophisticated political security apparatus, using a system of court suggestion boxes that functioned as an anonymous denunciation network, feeding information to her agents about officials who might be disloyal. Torture was used systematically. Families of accused officials were destroyed alongside the accused themselves. She formally declared her own dynasty, the Zhou, in 690 CE, making her the ruling emperor of China at an age when most people of the era would already be considered elderly. She elevated Buddhism to state religion and commissioned the enormous Vairocana Buddha at Longmen Grottoes near Luoyang, a statue whose serene face, some scholars have speculated, was carved to resemble her own. She expanded the civil service examination system in ways that genuinely broke the aristocratic monopoly on court positions and allowed talented men of lower birth to rise through merit, a reform with lasting structural significance. She was deposed in the Shenlong coup of 705 CE at roughly 80 years old, her dynasty name stripped, her reign folded back into the Tang records. She died that same year. She had reportedly requested that her tombstone at Qianling Mausoleum be left completely blank, an empty stele that stands there still, one of the most haunting objects in Chinese history, a monument to a life that no single inscription could contain. Empress Dowager Liu of Song. Empress Dowager Liu is sometimes called the Wu Zetian of the Song dynasty, a comparison she may have actively cultivated. She reportedly asked her court officials directly whether the path Wu Zetian had walked, to rule as emperor in her own name, was open to her. The officials told her, with the careful diplomacy of men whose careers and heads depended on the answer, that it was not. She did not press the point, but the question itself tells you something important about how she understood her own position. Liu Yanyi had risen from genuinely humble origins, possibly as a remarried widow, a background that court aristocrats found deeply objectionable and attempted to use against her repeatedly, though she outlasted every one of her detractors. She became Emperor Zhenzong's favorite and then his empress despite sustained opposition, and when Zhenzong died in 1022 CE, she became regent for the young Emperor Renzong, a role she held for over a decade. Her administration was competent, her handling of the Song bureaucracy steady, and her relationship with the conservative faction of court officials generally functional. But the act that defines her legacy in Chinese popular memory has nothing to do with policy. Renzong was not actually her biological son. He had been born to a concubine named Lady Li, and Empress Liu had taken him to raise as her own, which was standard palace practice. What was not standard was what happened to Lady Li over the following years. She was kept at a careful distance from her own son, never allowed the relationship that might have given her leverage, never told that the emperor knew who she was. According to the historical record, Renzong grew up believing Empress Liu was his birth mother, a deception maintained through his entire childhood and into his reign. Lady Li died, still separated from her son. Renzong reportedly discovered the truth only after Empress Dowager Liu died in 1033 CE, finding documents or being told by court insiders, and according to the Song Shi, he was devastated, collapsing in grief at the realization that his birth mother had lived and died within the same palace walls while he was kept from her. The psychological cruelty of this, the use of a child as a tool in a court power competition, the erasure of a mother from her son's entire life, is not the explosive operatic violence of Lady Qi's fate, but it is a different kind of profound damage. Empress Dowager Liu also caused a significant court scandal in 1032 CE, when she appeared in full imperial regalia during a formal ceremony, regalia that was the visual vocabulary of the emperor himself, prompting intense debate about whether she was staging a symbolic claim to imperial authority. She backed down, but she had asked the question. That she asked it at all tells you she never quite accepted that the throne was not hers. Empress Dowager Xie of Liao. Empress Dowager Xiao Yanyan occupies a unique position in this list, because she did something that almost none of the others did. She personally led armies into battle. The Liao dynasty, founded by the Khitan people of northeastern Asia, ruled a vast territory that included significant portions of what is now northern China, and it is fully part of the sweep of Chinese imperial history, even if it tends to get skipped in narratives focused exclusively on Han Chinese dynasties. After Emperor Jingzong died in 982 CE, Xiao Yanyan became regent for her young son, Emperor Shengzong, and made clear almost immediately that the regency was not going to be managed from behind a curtain. She conducted the military and administrative functions of the state with direct personal involvement, including riding with the army. In 1004 CE, she co-commanded the major Liao invasion of Song China, appearing at the front lines in a development that Song commanders found deeply disorienting, since fighting an enemy army whose commanding presence was a woman on horseback was not a scenario their military doctrine had prepared them for. The campaign reached the town of Shanzhou, close enough to the Song heartland that the Song Emperor Zhenzong came north in person to rally his forces. The result was the Chan-Yuan Treaty of 1005 CE, one of the most consequential diplomatic agreements in East Asian history. The Song dynasty agreed to pay the Liao an annual tribute of 100,000 taels of silver and 200,000 bolts of silk, a formal acknowledgement of Liao military superiority that shaped the balance of power in the region for generations. Back at court, Xiao Yanyan maintained an open, intimate relationship with a Han Chinese official named Han Durang, a relationship that became increasingly public after her husband's death, and that may have constituted a private remarriage, though the exact nature of the relationship is debated in historical sources. Han Durang's influence over court appointments generated significant resentment, and Xiao Yanyan's willingness to shield him at the expense of other Liao nobles created lasting factional tensions. She also executed or removed nobles within the Xiao clan itself, her own family, when she perceived them as threats to her son's authority. A willingness to cannibalize her own support base that speaks to how seriously she took the project of keeping the emperor, and through him herself, in power. Her legacy is one of genuine military and political achievement, built on a foundation of ruthlessness that extended in every direction, including toward the people who should have been most safe from her. Empress Dowager Xie of Southern Song. The Southern Song dynasty did not end with a treaty. It did not end with a surrender ceremony or a peaceful transfer of power. It ended in the sea, in 1279 CE, at the naval battle of Yamen, where the last Song loyalists made their final stand against the Mongol Yuan forces of Kublai Khan and lost so completely that a senior official named Lu Shufu, rather than allow the 7-year-old Emperor Bing to fall into Mongol hands, carried the child emperor into the ocean and drowned with him. Hundreds of court members, concubines, and attendants followed, jumping from the ships into the water. The Song dynasty, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, a culture that had developed printing, gunpowder weapons, the magnetic compass, and paper money, ended in a mass drowning. The path to that catastrophe ran directly through the court of Empress Dowager Xie, who served as regent for the succession of child emperors in the dynasty's dying years after Emperor Duzong's death in 1274 CE. The court over which she presided had been structurally hollowed out by decades of misrule under the chancellor, Jia Nanfeng, a figure who had monopolized political power, suppressed accurate military reporting, and left the Song's defenses in a state of dangerous weakness. Jia Nanfeng was finally removed in 1275 CE, too late to matter, and was murdered shortly after in exile. Empress Dowager Xie and the court she led continued to prioritize factional politics and court survival over the practical questions of how to stop a Mongol army that had already taken most of their territory. The Mongol advance was not gradual. It was devastating, and the court's response was characterized by the kind of institutional paralysis that happens when the people in charge have spent their entire careers optimizing for influence within a system that no longer exists. She eventually surrendered to Kublai Khan and was taken to Khanbalik, the Mongol capital that would become Beijing, where she and the surviving members of the Song court lived out the rest of their lives in captivity, some of the women reportedly forced into religious service. The cruelty here is not the sharp kind. It is the diffuse and enormous cruelty of a leadership class that consumed the resources and attention of an empire for decades, while that empire burned around them, and then watched children drown in the sea rather than having done anything meaningful to prevent it. Empress Ki. Empress Ki's story begins with an act of violence that was not hers. She was taken from Korea as a tribute woman, part of the Gongyo system by which the Mongol Yuan dynasty extracted young women from the Goryeo kingdom as human tribute, a practice that devastated Korean families and caused enormous social trauma across generations. She arrived at the Yuan court in the 1330s as property, an object of tribute, a symbol of Korean subjugation to Mongol power. What she became from that starting point is one of the most extraordinary transformations in medieval East Asian history. Through intelligence, physical presence, and whatever combination of charm and calculation she deployed on Emperor Togun Timur, she became his secondary empress, the mother of the crown prince, and one of the most powerful figures at the Mongol court. And then she used that power in ways that make her one of the most reviled figures in Korean historical memory. She leveraged her position to intervene systematically in Goryeo's internal affairs, pressuring the Yuan court to depose Korean kings who did not sufficiently serve her family's interests and install more compliant replacements. Her relatives were placed in positions of authority in Korea. The Korean royal family, the very institution that had sent her away as tribute, now answered to her. As the Yuan dynasty began fracturing under the pressure of the Red Turban rebellions that swept China from 1351 onward, Empress Ki's relationship with the emperor deteriorated into something close to open war. She and her son Crown Prince Ayushiridara became increasingly aggressive in pushing for the emperor to abdicate in his son's favor, a move that would have transferred all real power to her. Some sources allege she organized a poisoning attempt against Togun Timur when direct pressure failed, though this specific claim remains contested in the scholarship. When Ming forces under Zhu Yuanzhang captured Khanbalik in 1368, Empress Ki fled north with the remnants of the Yuan court into the Mongolian steppe. The dynasty she had climbed to the summit of was over. Ayushiridara eventually became ruler of the northern Yuan in exile, which means that, in a narrow technical sense, the tribute woman from Korea who had been sent away as property ended up as the mother of a Khan. The moral accounting of her life is genuinely complicated. The violence she deployed was real, but so was the violence done to her first. And the question of where survival ends and cruelty begins is not one that has a clean answer. Consort Wan. Consort Wan, also known as Lady Wan Jenner, held the rank of imperial noble consort rather than empress, which meant that her power over the court of Emperor Chenghua was entirely informal, unsupported by title, and therefore required constant and ruthless maintenance. She was 17 years older than the emperor, had served as his nursemaid during his deeply traumatic childhood, a childhood that included being stripped of his crown prince status for years, while his father cycled through political crises. And the relationship that developed between them has been analyzed by historians across a wide spectrum, from genuine mutual devotion to a psychologically dependent attachment that the emperor never fully separated from his need for maternal protection. Whatever its emotional texture, its political consequences were devastating. What the Ming Shilu and later sources document is a systematic campaign to ensure that no other woman at court produced an heir who might displace Lady Wan's influence over the emperor. Concubines who became pregnant found their pregnancies terminated. Infants who survived birth found themselves endangered. The mechanism was Lady Wan's network of palace eunuchs, who moved through the Forbidden City's interior world with access that no one outside the palace walls could monitor or contest, carrying out the work of eliminating potential heirs and reporting back on any concubine who might be concealing a pregnancy. This campaign apparently continued for over a decade, during which Emperor Chenghua was believed by many at court to have no viable male heir. The reality was that a son had been born in 1470 to a concubine who had encountered the emperor briefly, and that this boy had been kept alive and hidden by sympathetic servants and a network of people within the palace who were quietly horrified by what Lady Wan's agents were doing. The child grew to the age of 5 years old without his own father knowing he existed. When the boy was finally revealed to Emperor Chenghua in 1475, according to the historical accounts, the emperor wept. He touched the child's hair and wept. He had a son and had not known it for 5 years, and the reason he had not known was the woman he loved above everyone else at court. Lady Wan's position deteriorated from that moment, though she retained the emperor's affection until her death in 1487 CE. The emperor reportedly stopped eating after she died, said that it was over for him, and died himself within months. Whatever that says about him, it tells you something about her too, that she had become so completely woven into his psychology that he could not survive her absence, which is its own kind of terrible power. Empress Dowager Li of Wanli. Empress Dowager Li, the birth mother of the Wanli emperor, did not poison anyone. She did not execute rivals or forge edicts or lead armies. What she did was participate in a governing partnership with the Grand Secretary Zhang Juzheng that shaped the Ming dynasty's trajectory for a generation, and in doing so, she helped produce one of the most psychologically damaged rulers in Chinese imperial history. A man whose response to her domineering influence was to withdraw from the business of governing entirely and nearly hollow out the dynasty from within. Zhang Juzheng served as Grand Secretary from 1572 until his death in 1582 CE, and during that time implemented the single whip tax reform and a series of fiscal and administrative changes that historians have credited with significantly extending the Ming dynasty's fiscal stability. None of this would have been possible without Empress Dowager Li's absolute backing, because Zhang Juzheng had powerful enemies at court who would have removed him without her protection. She enforced compliance with his program, and the methods of enforcement included public corporal punishment of scholar officials, men of high educational and social status beaten in the palace courtyard, a humiliation that was deeply felt and never forgotten. After Zhang Juzheng died in 1582, the resentment that had been suppressed for a decade erupted immediately. His family was destroyed, his property confiscated, his corpse nearly disinterred, and his reforms largely dismantled. Empress Dowager Li, who had made it all possible, faced no consequences. What she left behind was her son. The Wanli emperor had grown up under her strict control, subject to her standards and her discipline and her overwhelming presence. And when he finally held real power, he responded to it by doing almost nothing. His famous withdrawal from court participation, during which he refused to attend audiences, refused to make appointments, refused to respond to memorials, lasted for roughly 30 years of his reign, and created a governing paralysis that structural historians of the Ming, including Ray Huang in his influential study 1587, A Year of No Significance, have identified as one of the key factors in the dynasty's eventual collapse. The causal chain here is interpretive, and it would be unfair to place the full weight of the Ming dynasty's fall on a woman's parenting choices. But the pattern is there. An empress dowager who controlled her son so completely that the adult emperor she produced could not function, and an empire that paid the price for that psychological inheritance across generations. Empress Dowager Xie. Empress Dowager Xie entered the Forbidden City as a concubine of the 5th rank, one of dozens of young women selected from Manchu noble families to fill out Emperor Xianfeng's household, a woman with no guaranteed path to power and every statistical reason to live out her years in gilded obscurity. She had one thing that changed everything. She was the only consort to give Xianfeng a surviving son. That son became Emperor Tongji, and from the moment of his birth, Cixi was no longer just a concubine. She was the mother of the heir. And in Qing dynasty succession politics, that was a form of armor that almost nothing could pierce. When Xianfeng died in 1861 CE, while the court was in exile in Reihe, having fled the capital ahead of the Anglo-French forces who would burn the old summer palace to ruins, he left behind a regency council of 8 officials that was designed specifically to balance power and prevent any single faction, including his concubines, from dominating. Cixi and Empress Dowager Xie, the official empress, moved within weeks. In the Xinyu coup of 1861, working in alliance with Prince Gong, they arrested and effectively neutralized the 8 regents, executing the 2 most prominent ones, and established a co-regency. The coup was clean, fast, and total in its outcome. What followed was nearly 50 years of Cixi's dominance over Chinese politics, during which China suffered a sequence of military humiliations that stripped away territory, sovereignty, and the dynasty's remaining credibility. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 ended with China ceding Taiwan and acknowledging Korean independence, an outcome that shocked even those who had expected the Qing military to perform poorly. Cixi is famously accused of diverting funds intended for naval modernization to rebuild the summer palace, specifically constructing the marble boat, the Qingyanfeng, a stone pavilion built in the shape of a paddle steamer that cannot move, as a symbol of either her vanity or her indifference to national defense, though some historians argue the causal relationship between her spending and the fleet's military failures is more complicated than the marble boat anecdote suggests. The 100 Days Reform of 1898 brought the conflict between Cixi and the modernizers to its crisis point. Emperor Guangxu, her nephew, whom she had placed on the throne after Tongji died without an heir, attempted over 103 days to implement sweeping changes to the military, the bureaucracy, the educational system, and the economy. Cixi moved against him, staging a coup, placing him under house arrest on an island in the lake of the Summer Palace, having the reform leaders executed or exiled, and rescinding virtually everything. Guangxu spent the next 10 years as a prisoner in all but name. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900, which Cixi supported or at minimum failed to suppress, ended with the 8-nation alliance occupying Beijing and the court fleeing again, this time to Xi'an, and the Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposing reparations equivalent to the entire empire's annual revenue for decades. She came back, made some gestures toward the constitutional reform she had previously crushed, and continued ruling until the very end. Emperor Guangxu died on November 14, 1908. Cixi died on November 15th. The timing alone would be suspicious, but in 2008, a forensic study by a Chinese Academy of Sciences research team analyzed Guangxu's preserved remains and found arsenic concentrations roughly 2,000 times the level found in normal human tissue, consistent with acute arsenic poisoning and wildly inconsistent with natural death. The study has been reviewed with some skepticism in Western academic circles regarding its methodology, but the finding is consistent with what contemporaries already suspected, that Cixi, knowing she was dying, arranged to have the emperor she had spent a decade imprisoning killed before she went, so that he could not undo her legacy from the throne. She named a 2-year-old as his successor. That 2-year-old was Puyi, the last emperor of China, the final chapter of an imperial system that Cixi had spent half a century fighting to preserve and simultaneously undermining beyond recovery. Merit-Neith. The oldest entry on this list comes from a time so ancient that even ancient Egyptians considered it mythological, and Merit-Neith, whose name translates to beloved of Neith, the goddess of war and hunting, fits that mythological scale perfectly. She lived and ruled around 2950 BCE, during Egypt's first dynasty, a period when the pharaonic state was so new that its rules were still being written, sometimes literally in the blood of the people buried alongside its rulers. Merit-Neith almost certainly came to power as regent for her son Den, who was too young to govern when his father, the pharaoh Jet, died. But the physical evidence of her rule, the kind carved in stone and dug from the desert sand, tells a story far larger than the word regent implies. Her tomb at Abydos, designated Tomb Y by archaeologists, was built to pharaonic scale, not to the scale of a queen's burial. It sits among the tombs of the early kings, sized like theirs, structured like theirs, and surrounded by something that makes it genuinely disturbing to stand near even in photographs. Surrounding her central tomb are rows of smaller graves, subsidiary burials of servants, officials, and retainers who were killed specifically so they could accompany her into the afterlife. Approximately 40 people died, so that Merit-Neith would not have to navigate death alone. This was not unique to her. Early dynastic pharaohs practiced retainer sacrifice regularly, and the graves of kings like Jair contained far more. But Merit-Neith authorized or was the occasion of dozens of deaths, and the sheer administrative coldness of that, the logistical planning required to kill and bury 40 human beings in precise formation around a single grave, says something about the world she ruled and the power she held within it. Her name appears on the Palermo stone, one of the oldest surviving records of Egyptian kingship, and seal impressions found at Abydos list her among the kings rather than the queens, suggesting that at least some of her contemporaries understood her role as more than a placeholder. Later king lists erased her, as they would erase so many women who followed her, because acknowledging a female pharaoh complicated the clean patrilineal succession narratives that later dynasties preferred. Whether Merit-Neith herself chose to embrace full pharaonic power, or whether it was thrust upon her by circumstance, the archaeological record confirms that she ruled, that she was remembered as a ruler, and that approximately 40 people paid for that memory with their lives. That is, by any measure, a remarkable and chilling foundation for this list. Nitocris. If Merit-Neith is the most archaeologically real entry on this list, Nitocris is the most cinematically perfect, and also possibly the most completely fictional, which is its own kind of disturbing. Ancient sources describe her as the last ruler of the Old Kingdom's 6th dynasty, reigning around 2184 to 2181 BCE, at the very moment when one of history's greatest early civilizations was collapsing under the weight of drought, administrative failure, and regional fragmentation. According to Herodotus, writing in his histories nearly 1700 years after the events he describes, Nitocris came to power after her brother, the rightful pharaoh, was murdered by Egyptian nobles, who then, more or less, forced the throne upon her, presumably believing a grieving woman would be easier to manage than a fighting king. They were spectacularly wrong. Herodotus describes Nitocris as biding her time, constructing a large underground chamber under the pretense of building something magnificent, and then inviting every single person responsible for her brother's death to a grand banquet inside it. When the hall was full and the wine was flowing, she opened hidden channels that diverted the Nile directly into the sealed chamber and drowned every one of her guests while she watched from above. Then, according to Herodotus, to escape the retribution that would inevitably follow, she threw herself into a room full of hot ashes and suffocated, dying on her own terms before anyone could punish her. It is an extraordinary story. It is also almost certainly not true, or at least not entirely true. The Egyptian priest and historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, also included Nitocris in his king lists, giving her a reign of around 12 years and describing her as the most noble and beautiful woman of her time, with rosy cheeks. The Turin King List, an ancient Egyptian papyrus document that records the names and reign lengths of pharaohs, appears to include a female ruler at the end of the 6th dynasty, which would be consistent with Nitocris. But modern Egyptologists, particularly Kim Reichelt, have argued that Nitocris may be a garbled or mythologized version of a male pharaoh named Necherkare-Siptah, whose name could have been misread or mistranslated in a way that produced a female identity. If Reichelt is correct, then Nitocris is not a real person at all, but a legend, a story that ancient Egyptians told themselves about the end of the Old Kingdom, a revenge fantasy attached to a civilizational catastrophe, and that almost makes it worse. The fact that Egyptians living through the collapse of their civilization reached for the image of an avenging queen as the figure who went out in flames, taking her enemies with her, tells you something profound about how they processed this catastrophe. Real or not, Nitocris haunts the end of the Old Kingdom like smoke, and the story Herodotus preserved has more dramatic architecture than most things that actually happened. Sobekneferu. Where Nitocris floats in the uncertain space between history and legend, Sobekneferu stands on completely solid ground, and she did it first. She is the first woman in Egyptian history confirmed by contemporary archaeological evidence to have held the full title and regalia of pharaoh, meaning not a regent, not a consort, not a divine wife, but the actual ruler of Egypt with all the trappings that entailed. She came to the throne at the very end of the 12th dynasty, around 1806 BCE, following the death of Amenemhat, who was likely her brother or half-brother, and she ruled for approximately 4 years before the dynasty simply ended. Her surviving statuary is remarkable and strange, showing a female face wearing combinations of both male and female royal dress, the masculine Nimes headdress combined with a female sheath dress, a visual argument that she was both and neither, that the categories of male and female pharaoh could not quite contain what she was doing. Her name means Beauty of Sobek, the crocodile god, a deity associated with the dangerous, fertile, unpredictable power of the Nile, and she invested heavily in his cult, constructing and modifying religious installations in his honor. She also completed or significantly expanded the mortuary complex of her predecessor Amenemhat III at Hawara, a structure so elaborate in its corridors and chambers that Herodotus, visiting centuries later, described it as more impressive than the pyramids themselves, calling it the labyrinth, an almost incomprehensible maze of 12 covered courts, 3,000 rooms split between above and below ground, and walls covered in carvings. Sobekneferu's decision to complete this monument rather than build her own says something about her political positioning, her need to associate herself with the legitimate male pharaohs who came before her, rather than assert an entirely independent identity. Despite that caution, she was erased from later king lists, including those at Abydos and Saqqara, which recorded the official lineage of pharaohs for religious and political purposes. She was inconvenient. A female pharaoh at the end of a collapsing dynasty, presiding over the final years before the chaos of the Second Intermediate Period, was exactly the kind of historical figure that later rulers preferred to simply not mention. Her tomb has never been found, which is extraordinary for a confirmed pharaoh, and suggests either deliberate erasure or an as-yet undiscovered burial, possibly somewhere within or near the Hawara complex she helped build. The evil framing for Sobekneferu is largely the one applied to her by history itself. She was blamed, as female rulers often were, for the instability that followed her reign, even though the 12th dynasty's collapse had structural causes far larger than any single ruler could create or prevent. She deserves better. She also deserves a tomb someone can find. Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for approximately 20 years. From around 1478 to 1458 BCE, built more monuments than any pharaoh in the preceding century, launched one of antiquity's most successful trading expeditions, and was so effectively erased from history by her successor that it took 19th and 20th century archaeology to fully reconstruct her reign. She started as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, who was the son of Thutmose II, and a secondary wife after Thutmose II's death left a child on the throne. Within a few years of the regency, she had declared herself full pharaoh, donning the double crown, the false beard, the male titulary, and the full visual language of kingship in official monuments, while apparently continuing to present as female in other contexts. The tension in her reign is this: was she a usurper who took a throne that belonged to a child? Or was she a supremely competent administrator who kept Egypt stable and prosperous for 2 decades, while that child grew into the capable military commander he would later become? The evidence supports both readings simultaneously. Under her reign, Egypt was peaceful internally, economically productive, and architecturally prolific. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, cut into the limestone cliffs on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, is one of the most beautiful structures the ancient world produced, a terraced masterpiece of white limestone colonnades rising in 3 levels against the golden cliff face. Its walls contain the detailed illustrated account of her expedition to the land of Punt, a mysterious trading partner that Egyptologists believe was located somewhere in the Horn of Africa region, possibly modern-day Eritrea, Somalia, or Djibouti. The expedition returned with live myrrh trees transported in baskets, the first recorded attempt to transplant foreign trees, along with ebony, ivory, animal skins, and living animals. It was an extraordinary logistical and diplomatic achievement. She also commissioned 2 pairs of obelisks at Karnak, the great temple complex at Thebes, and one of those obelisks still stands today, rising approximately 29.5 meters, and still bearing its original inscriptions. Her chief steward, a man named Senenmut, appears throughout her reign as her closest collaborator and most trusted official, and the ancient gossip about their relationship was intense enough that graffiti from her own era, found scratched on rock faces near Deir el-Bahri, depicted them in explicitly sexual positions, a kind of ancient tabloid commentary that tells you contemporaries noticed the closeness and were happy to speculate about it. Whether the relationship was romantic, political, purely professional, or some combination is impossible to determine, But Senenmut disappears from the historical record before Hatshepsut's death, and nobody knows why. The erasure came after her death, likely initiated by Thutmose III, or possibly his son Amenhotep decades into the subsequent reign. Workers were sent to chisel her image from temple walls, smash her statues, remove her name from inscriptions, and replace her image with that of Thutmose II, Thutmose III, or blank space. The systematic nature of it is staggering. It was not vandalism, but administration, organized and thorough. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's excavations at Deir el-Bahri in the 20th century recovered hundreds of pieces of smashed Hatshepsut statuary that had been thrown into a pit. Red granite faces, limestone torsos, the remnants of what must have been a spectacular sculptural program. Egyptologists debate the motive for the erasure. Revenge by a stepson who spent 20 years waiting for his throne is the romantic interpretation. A more practical reading is that removing a female pharaoh from the official lineage made the succession from Thutmose II to Thutmose III look clean and uninterrupted, which was important for both religious legitimacy and political stability. The irony is that the erasure failed. Hatshepsut survived it. Her story recovered from exactly the walls and pits where her enemies buried it, and she is now probably the most famous female pharaoh in history. The evil that history applied to her, the charge of usurpation, the insinuation that female rule was inherently transgressive, says far more about the men who came after her than about what she actually did. Neferneferuaten. If Hatshepsut is the female pharaoh whose erasure failed, Neferneferuaten is the one whose erasure may have actually worked, because Egyptologists likely still cannot agree on who she was, what she did, or even whether she is one person or two. And the controversy surrounding her reign is bound up in one of the strangest episodes in all of Egyptian history. Her name appears in the wreckage of the Amarna period, the roughly 17-year reign of Akhenaten in the mid-14th century BCE, during which the pharaoh attempted to abolish Egypt's traditional pantheon and replace it with the exclusive worship of a single solar deity, the Aten, represented as a disk with rays ending in tiny hands. Akhenaten moved the capital from Thebes to a new city in the desert at modern Amarna, commissioned an entirely new artistic style that depicted the royal family with elongated skulls, swollen bellies, and almost feminine proportions regardless of gender, and presided over what most Egyptians of the following century would remember as a national catastrophe. At his side throughout almost all of it was his great royal wife, Nefertiti, whose name means "the beautiful one has come," and whose limestone bust, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose at Amarna in 1912 by a German archaeological team, is now in the Neues Museum in Berlin, and is one of the most recognizable objects in the entire ancient world. Toward the end of Akhenaten's reign, around 1336 BCE, a figure named Neferneferuaten appears in the royal record as either co-regent or successor, holding full pharaonic titles. And the prevailing theory among Egyptologists, including Aidan Dodson and Mark Gabold, is that this Neferneferuaten is Nefertiti herself, elevated to kingship either alongside Akhenaten in his final years or immediately after his death. The evidence for the identification is largely linguistic. Some of Neferneferuaten's cartouches contain feminine grammatical forms and epithets like effective for her husband, which would be impossible to apply to a male pharaoh, and which point directly back to Nefertiti, whose full name was in fact Neferneferuaten Nefertiti. Other Egyptologists, including James Allen, have argued that Neferneferuaten was not Nefertiti at all, but a different royal woman, possibly Merit-Neith, the eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who would have inherited the throne in her own right after her parents were gone. The question is genuinely unresolved, and the silence on it from the archaeological record is part of what makes the Amarna period feel so deeply uncanny. What is certain is that some woman ruled Egypt at the end of Akhenaten's experiment, briefly, and that she presided over the collapse of his religious revolution and the beginning of the return to traditional worship. A diplomatic letter from this period, found in the Hittite archives at Hattusa and known as the Deeds of Suppiluliuma, describes a remarkable incident in which an Egyptian queen, identified only by a title the Hittites rendered as Dahamunzu, meaning the king's wife, Jigmai wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma begging him to send one of his sons to marry her because her husband had died and she had no son, and she refused to marry one of her servants. The letter is extraordinary in tone, almost panicked, and it goes against every protocol of Egyptian foreign policy, which never imported foreign royalty as consorts. Suppiluliuma, suspicious but tempted, eventually sent his son Zenanza south, and Zenanza was assassinated en route, almost certainly by Egyptian factions opposed to the plan. The widow in the letter is unnamed, and Egyptologists have spent a century arguing about who she was. The candidates are Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's widow, or Nefertiti as Nefer-Neferuiten in the days after Akhenaten's death, and the dating of the letter is contested enough that either is possible. If it was Nefer-Neferuiten, then the picture that emerges is staggering. A woman who had stood beside her husband through a religious revolution, who may have ruled briefly in her own right, was so isolated and so threatened in the aftermath of his death that she reached across enemy lines to a country Egypt had been fighting on and off for decades, asking for a marriage that would place a Hittite prince on the throne of Egypt, simply because she could see no other path to survival. The Amarna period ended badly for almost everyone involved. Akhenaten's city was abandoned within a generation, the new capital pulled down for building materials, his name and Nefer-Neferuiten's and Nefertiti's all chiseled out of monuments by the priests of Amun whose god they had tried to suppress. The list of erased pharaohs from the period, called the Amarna heretics, by later Egyptian record keepers, was treated as a single cursed unit by the 19th dynasty king lists, which jumped from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb as if nothing had happened in between. Whoever Nefer-Neferuiten was, whatever she did or tried to do, the official memory of Egypt decided collectively that she had not existed. The fact that we are still arguing about her identity 3,000 years later is testament to how thoroughly that erasure was attempted and how partially it succeeded. The evil attached to her, if it exists at all, is the evil of association, the contamination of having stood inside a religious revolution that the Egyptian establishment came to regard as a wound that needed to be cauterized from the historical record. And it is worth being specific about what that revolution actually involved, because the Amarna period is often described in soft language, the words reform and experiment and monotheism, doing a great deal of work to disguise what was, on the ground, a campaign of religious persecution unprecedented in Egyptian history. Akhenaten's agents traveled the length of the Nile chiseling the name of Amun from temple walls, smashing the statues of the old gods, closing the temples that had employed and fed entire communities for generations, defunding the priestly establishments that had been Egypt's largest civilian institutions for 1,000 years, and in doing so they impoverished and humiliated tens of thousands of people whose lives depended on the old order. If Nefertiti was Nefer-Neferuiten, she stood at the center of this campaign as great royal wife and likely as co-architect, depicted on temple talatat blocks, not just observing the new religion, but actively performing it, smiting enemies in the traditional pharaonic pose that had previously been reserved for kings. There is a scene from a Karnak temple, since dismantled, in which Nefertiti is shown striking down a foreign captive with a mace, blood implied, a piece of royal iconography that no queen before her had ever been permitted. Whatever else this woman was, she was not decorative. She participated in the violence of state religion at a level no Egyptian woman had previously been allowed to claim. After Akhenaten's death, the religious counter-revolution was swift and total. Tutankhaten, the boy king who was almost certainly Akhenaten's son, and possibly Nefertiti's, changed his name to Tutankhamun within a few years of his accession, abandoned Amarna, restored the temples of Amun, and issued a restoration stela now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, describing the state of Egypt before his reforms as one in which the gods had abandoned the land and the army had failed in foreign campaigns because the temples were neglected. Whether the boy himself wrote this is unlikely. He was perhaps 9 years old at his accession and dead at 19. The men around him, the General Horemheb and the courtier A, were the architects of the reversal, and they were also the candidates for who actually killed off the last traces of Nefer-Neferuiten's regime. The mystery of KV-55, a small and chaotic tomb in the Valley of the Kings, discovered in 1907 containing a damaged coffin and a mummy whose identity has been disputed for over a century, sits at the heart of all this. The mummy is now generally believed to be Akhenaten himself, possibly relocated from Amarna by Tutankhamun's officials in an attempt to reunite the heretic king with his ancestors. But the coffin's cartouches had been deliberately gouged out, the gold mask peeled off, and the face of the mummy itself damaged in what looks like a deliberate ritual mutilation aimed at preventing the dead king from achieving a peaceful afterlife. If they did that to Akhenaten, who at least had the protection of being a confirmed male pharaoh, it is not hard to imagine what they did to the records of Nefer-Neferuiten, whose hold on legitimacy was already precarious by virtue of being a woman ruling at the end of a discredited regime. The famous Nefertiti bust survives only by accident, abandoned in a sculptor's workshop when Amarna was evacuated, buried under sand for 33 centuries, until a German team excavated it on December 6, 1912, and removed it to Berlin under circumstances that the Egyptian government has been disputing as illegitimate ever since. The face it preserves, with its long neck and impossibly serene composure, is almost certainly the face of a pharaoh, and not just a queen. And the irony is that the most recognizable woman from ancient Egypt is recognizable largely because nobody at the time knew enough about her to destroy her image properly. She may have been a competent ruler trying to manage an impossible situation. She may have been a desperate widow reaching for a Hittite prince. She may have been a religious zealot complicit in the persecution of an entire priesthood, and she may have been all three of those things in sequence. The thing she was not, and the thing history made her, is forgotten. Taoshret. Taoshret's path to power is one of the most twisting and treacherous in Egyptian history, a decades-long ascent through the roles of royal wife, regent, co-ruler, and finally pharaoh, each step shadowed by deaths, depositions, and the very particular kind of palace intrigue that the late 19th dynasty specialized in. She began as the great royal wife of Seti II, which placed her at the center of Egyptian power during a period of intense internal competition for the throne. When Seti II died around 1197 BCE, the next pharaoh was Siptah, a child with a physical disability affecting his left foot, likely a clubfoot based on analysis of his mummy, who may have been her stepson. Taoshret became his regent, and alongside her in the court was a remarkably powerful Syrian official named Bey, who held the title of chancellor and whose influence over the young pharaoh was extensive enough that he appeared in royal iconography at a scale nearly equal to the pharaoh himself, which was deeply unusual for anyone who was not a member of the royal family. The relationship between Taoshret and Bey during Siptah's reign is murky, but they appear to have operated in tandem, the two most powerful non-child figures in a government notionally led by a child. Then Bey was executed. A small ostracon, a chip of limestone used as an informal writing surface, discovered at Deir el-Medina and dating to Siptah's reign, contains a message from the pharaoh stating that he has killed the great enemy Bey, using language that implies Bey had overstepped in some significant way. The extraordinary thing is that this execution order appears to have come from the child pharaoh himself, which raises the immediate question of whether Siptah had developed enough independence to move against his own chancellor, or whether someone else was pulling the strings, and Siptah's name was simply the one on the document. Taoshret is the obvious candidate for that someone else. Siptah died around 1191 BCE, after a reign of roughly 6 years, and Taoshret then declared herself full pharaoh, taking the double crown and ruling in her own right for approximately 2 more years. Her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV-14, is one of the largest in the entire valley, with long descending corridors decorated with astronomical ceilings in deep blue and gold, the Amduat and Book of Gates rendered in vivid detail across its walls, a statement of ambition and theological seriousness that a mere placeholder ruler would not have bothered to make. After her death, the 19th dynasty collapsed entirely, and Setnecht, founder of the 20th dynasty, rewrote the official historical record to cast her as a usurper and illegitimate ruler. He seized her tomb, extended its corridors for his own burial, and painted over her images. Her name was removed from king lists. She became another historical ghost. Her name means powerful one of Isis, and her iconography consistently invoked Isis, the goddess associated with magical power, resurrection, and the ferocious protectiveness of a mother. Whether she was genuinely powerful in the way her name claimed, or whether she was a survivor who outlasted everyone around her and picked up the crown that remained, the result was the same. She ruled Egypt, she built one of the valley's greatest tombs, and she was erased by the man who followed her, because acknowledging her complicated his own legitimacy. The deaths that orbit her reign, Bey's execution, Siptah's convenient timing, the collapse of the dynasty, may or may not have been her doing, but she was standing at the center of all of them. Cleopatra III. Before we get to the Cleopatra everyone knows, we need to talk about the one who actually fits the archetype that history later pinned on her descendant. Because Cleopatra III, ruling in the late 2nd century BCE, was operating at a level of ruthlessness that makes most of this list look restrained. She came into the Ptolemaic court under circumstances that were already brutal. She was married to Ptolemy Physcon, a nickname meaning potbelly, who was at the time also married to her mother, Cleopatra II. This was not an unusual arrangement by Ptolemaic standards, a dynasty that had been marrying siblings and relatives for generations to keep power consolidated. But even by those standards, it was a charred situation. Ancient sources, including the historian Justin and his epitome of the Philippic histories of Pompeius Trogus, report that the marriage was forced and that Physcon had raped Cleopatra III, making the origins of her political life a story of violation before it becomes a story of power. Physcon was not a gentle ruler. He had previously massacred the Alexandrian intelligentsia and sent Cleopatra II a package containing the dismembered body of their son as a birthday gift, which tells you the emotional temperature of this family. When Physcon died in 116 BCE, he left his kingdom to Cleopatra III and whichever of her sons she preferred, which was an extraordinary grant of power, but also set up the central conflict of the rest of her life. She co-ruled first with Ptolemy, her elder son, and then replaced him with her younger son Ptolemy, and the ancient sources describe this process as one of relentless maternal manipulation, aimed not at securing good government, but at maintaining her own grip on power at her son's expense. According to Justin, she went so far as to appear before the Alexandrian army with self-inflicted or fabricated wounds, claiming that Ptolemy had tried to assassinate her in order to turn military loyalty against her own son and justify his removal from power. Whether this is accurate or Roman-era slander is impossible to confirm, but the detail is specific enough and the source early enough that it has persisted as the defining story of her character. She associated herself religiously with Isis, as female Ptolemaic rulers regularly did, and inserted herself into temple iconography as a goddess, which gave her divine legitimacy to complement the political kind. She held Egyptian priestly titles alongside her Greek royal ones, navigating both cultural systems simultaneously in a way that required genuine intelligence and administrative skill. In the end, the son she had tried to dispose of returned the favor. Ptolemy X had her killed in 101 BCE, making her death the final act in a decades-long family war that she had been winning right up until the moment she wasn't. She ruled Egypt through one of its most geopolitically precarious periods, with Rome's shadow growing longer across the Mediterranean every decade, and she kept the Ptolemaic dynasty alive through sheer force of will and a willingness to do things that most rulers, male or female, would have hesitated to do. The fact that she is almost completely unknown outside of Egyptological circles, while her descendant became the most famous woman in history, is one of history's more ironic oversights. Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra VII is the entry that breaks the rules of this list, because the argument for her being here is not that she was evil, but that the entire machinery of Western historical memory worked for 2,000 years to make you believe she was, and examining that machinery tells you more about power and gender than almost anything else in ancient history. She came to the throne in 51 BCE, at around 18 years old, co-ruling first with her younger brother Ptolemy III, who was also nominally her husband in the Ptolemaic tradition. Within a few years, Ptolemy III, guided by his advisors, had her expelled from Alexandria, and she responded by raising a mercenary army on Egypt's eastern border and positioning herself for a civil war. Then Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria chasing Pompey, and everything changed. The story of Cleopatra rolling herself up in a carpet or linen sack to be smuggled past Ptolemy III's guards and delivered to Caesar is recorded by the ancient biographer Plutarch, and whatever the precise truth of the delivery mechanism, the meeting worked. A Caesar allied with Cleopatra. Her brother's forces besieged the palace. The great library of Alexandria's warehouse annex caught fire during the fighting. Ptolemy III drowned in the Nile trying to escape, and Cleopatra was restored to her throne. She was, by any measure, an extraordinarily capable political operator. Plutarch, writing in his Life of Antony approximately a century after her death, described her intelligence in terms that were almost reluctant in their admiration, noting that her voice was like a many-stringed instrument and that she spoke 9 languages fluently, including Egyptian, which no Ptolemaic ruler before her had bothered to learn in 3 centuries of ruling an Egyptian country. She was also trained in philosophy and mathematics, participated substantively in administrative decisions, and managed Egypt's grain economy, which was the economic engine that fed the ancient Mediterranean world. The real crimes attributable to her are specific and limited. She requested, and Mark Antony ordered, the execution of her sister Arsinoe IV at Ephesus in 41 BCE, where Arsinoe had taken refuge in a temple. Arsinoe had previously declared herself queen during Ptolemy the Thegnid's war against Cleopatra, and was a genuine rival claimant to the throne, so the killing was politically rational, but it was also the murder of her own sister, and the violation of a temple sanctuary made it scandalous even by ancient standards. She is also suspected, though not confirmed by any direct evidence, of having poisoned her younger brother and co-ruler Ptolemy XIII to consolidate her sole rule of Egypt. These are real. Everything else, the portrait of an Eastern seductress who used sexuality to bewitch great men and drag them away from their Roman virtue, is almost entirely the creation of Octavian's propaganda machine. Octavian needed Cleopatra to be a monster, because his war against her and Mark Antony needed to be framed as a defense of Roman civilization against Eastern corruption, rather than a Roman civil war, which is what it actually was. The poet Horace obligingly called her a fatale monstrum, a deadly monster, in his Odes. Other Roman writers described her as drunk, depraved, and surrounded by eunuchs. None of this squared with the actual historical record of her governance, but propaganda does not need to square with the record. It only needs to be repeated often enough. Her death in 30 BCE, after Octavian's forces had taken Alexandria, and it became clear she would be paraded through Rome in chains as a trophy of his triumph, was almost certainly a calculated final act of agency. The romantic asp story, the snake concealed in a basket of figs, is almost universally doubted by modern scholars, with researchers including Egyptologist Joyce Tildesley suggesting that poison of some kind, perhaps applied to a comb or a hairpin, was more likely the method. Whatever the mechanism, the choice was deliberate. She decided that dying on her own terms was preferable to the spectacle Octavian had planned for her, and she was right. Octavian was furious. He had wanted the living trophy, and she denied him that. She was, in the end, exactly as dangerous as Rome said she was, just not in the way they meant. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.